Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping, where we share real stories with a calm voice and a slow pace. True crime made for quiet evenings and restful nights. If you find yourself drawn into the quiet mystery, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and letting us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now, settle in. Take a breath. Let's begin. The town of Wrentham, Massachusetts, is the kind of place that doesn't ask for much attention. Nestled between the soft hills and scattered ponds of Norfolk County, it is small, quiet, and unassuming, where the roads curl gently around neighborhoods of modest homes, and life unfolds in slow, familiar rhythms. People greet each other at the post office. Kids walk to school in small packs, and the local diner knows most coffee orders by heart. So when Amy Travers failed to show up for work on a rainy Thursday morning in March of 1998, it stirred only the mildest of concerns at first. Amy was a 29-year-old paralegal at a small legal office on Main Street. She was punctual, polite, and not the sort of person to suddenly disappear. Her boss, Gregory Bell, left her a voicemail just before 10 a.m., assuming perhaps she was running late or stuck behind a minor emergency. But by lunchtime, the unease had grown into something deeper. Amy wasn't answering her phone. Her apartment phone rang through without response, and her car was missing from the small gravel parking lot behind her building. A co-worker stopped by her place after work, knocking on the door, peering through the windows. Nothing seemed disturbed, but Amy was simply gone. That evening, her sister, Carla, drove in from the next town over. She'd spoken to Amy 2 days earlier, an ordinary call, full of small talk and weekend plans. Nothing had seemed off. Now, standing in the quiet kitchen of her sister's small apartment, she felt the stirrings of panic blooming into something she could no longer ignore. By morning, a missing persons report had been filed. Wrentham police opened the investigation with their usual careful procedures. Sergeant Daniel Rawlins, a veteran officer with a calm demeanor and a reputation for thoroughness, took the lead. There was no sign of forced entry at Amy's apartment. Nothing was missing except her purse, her keys and her car, a 1993 Honda Accord with a fading rear bumper sticker that read "Books are better than people." Friends and family were interviewed. Co-workers described Amy as private but reliable. No recent breakups, no conflicts at work. She lived alone, read constantly, and volunteered twice a week at the public library. Her neighbors said she was friendly, though quiet, someone who smiled in passing but mostly kept to herself. A check of her phone records showed nothing unusual. The last call she made was to her sister. No known enemies. No ex-boyfriends lingering in the background. No suspicious activity on her bank accounts. And still, no sign of Amy. The first real development came 3 days later, when her car was found parked behind a shuttered bakery on a quiet side street in Providence, Rhode Island, nearly 30 miles from Wrentham. It was locked, clean and dry inside, as if it had never left town. The keys were gone. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone taller than Amy. Detective Joanna Curran from Providence was brought in to assist. She'd worked missing persons for 8 years, and although she was rarely surprised by anything anymore, something about the car's condition didn't sit right. "There's no reason for this car to be here," she said quietly, as she circled it. "No connection to this street. No connection to this city." Inside the glove compartment, officers found a folded piece of notepaper, tucked behind expired registration papers. It wasn't in Amy's handwriting. It read simply, "Don't look. You won't like what you find." The note was unsettling, but it also raised questions. Was it a warning? A threat? A clue planted by someone trying to mislead the investigation? Back in Wrentham, Carla sat alone on her sister's neatly made bed, the late afternoon sun slanting across the room. On the nightstand were Amy's reading glasses, a well-worn paperback, and a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She picked up the book, The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and ran her fingers over the dog-eared pages. In the margins, Amy had scribbled quiet thoughts, underlined passages, and noted character motivations. Carla had always known her sister to be reflective, even melancholy at times. But she had never sensed any darkness so deep it would make her walk away from her life. Unless she hadn't walked away at all. Police released a photo of Amy and her car to local media. Flyers went up across multiple counties. Tips came in mostly dead ends. People who thought they had seen her at a gas station, a grocery store, a bus terminal. None were confirmed. Days passed, then a week, then two. Eventually, media coverage faded, and the world kept turning. But those closest to Amy never stopped searching. Her friends created a small website. A reward was offered by a former classmate. A candlelight vigil was held in front of the town library, and in the background, Detective Curran and Sergeant Rawlins kept digging. They returned to Amy's apartment, reviewing everything again, this time with fresh eyes. Her desktop computer was old, slow and mostly used for email and writing documents. But hidden in one folder was a strange file, titled List, that at first glance looked like a grocery list or errand tracker. Except none of the names made sense. It contained about a dozen entries. Each one was a full name followed by a set of initials, and what appeared to be dates or short notes. Some were crossed out. Some were not. The fifth name on the list was circled twice. It read J. Carter, 3B, July 12, 1995, SOS. That name meant nothing to Carla, or to Amy's co-workers. But to Detective Curran, it rang a bell. She pulled records from a closed missing persons case from the summer of 1995. Joanna Cardenas, a college student who vanished without a trace from nearby Franklin, Massachusetts. Curran stared at the line on Amy's file, her stomach sinking. Joanna Cardenas was never found. Her case had gone cold years earlier. Now her name was turning up in the apartment of a woman who had also vanished. Was Amy investigating something? Had she stumbled into something larger? Curran dug further. Of the 12 names on the list, 5 had open or closed missing persons files. The remaining names were untraceable, either aliases, misspellings or perhaps red herrings. But the pattern was clear. Amy had been looking into missing persons cases. But why? The final clue of that week came from an unexpected place. A retired private investigator, named Harold Fenley, contacted Rentham PD after seeing the flyer. He had worked a freelance case in 1996, searching for a young man named Ellis Fry, who had disappeared on his way to a concert in Boston. That case had never been solved, and the parents had long since moved out of state. But what caught Harold's attention was the name of the paralegal listed on a form he'd once filed, Amy Travers. She had been working for a small law firm in Boston at the time. She'd signed her name on court documents and helped organize the missing persons file. According to Harold, she'd been unusually invested in that case, often asking questions outside her role, tracking down loose threads, even calling friends of the missing boy after hours. She told me once that she thought something bigger was going on, Harold recalled, voice soft and gravelly, that these cases weren't all separate, that someone was making people disappear. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and then he added something else. She said if she ever vanished, to look for the list. Sergeant Rawlins leaned back in his office chair, the printout of Amy's mysterious file resting between his fingers. The list she'd compiled, 12 names, 5 confirmed as past missing persons, had shifted the case into new and uncertain territory. For 2 weeks, the town of Rentham had assumed Amy's disappearance was isolated, perhaps a random act or some tragic private crisis. But now, the edges of something larger had begun to emerge. Detective Joanna Curran sat across from him, quietly scanning through the growing file. She was always quiet when she thought deeply, and her brows were furrowed now, not in frustration, but in the deep stillness of intuition hard at work. I think Amy wasn't just researching these names, Curran finally said. She was tracking someone, trying to piece something together. Sergeant Rawlins nodded slowly. And whoever she was tracking may have found her first. Curran closed the folder and tapped her pen softly on the desk. That list is our way forward. They started by revisiting the oldest name, Joanna Cardenas, the college student who vanished in 1995. Joanna had been a second-year anthropology major, last seen leaving the Franklin Public Library one summer evening. Her case had faded quickly, overshadowed by more high-profile crimes in nearby Boston, but the details had always unsettled Curran. Joanna's backpack was found at a bus stop with her wallet inside. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no follow-up leads. Curran pulled up the old file and examined it side by side with Amy's list. She was looking for pattern, common threads, geographical connections, shared routines. In small towns, disappearances usually left traces, but these didn't. They were all too clean. 3 more names from Amy's list led to similar stories. Young adults, mostly women, vanished in plain sight with no explanation. All had been within a 60-mile radius of Rentham. All occurred between 1992 and 1999. At the same time, Carla, Amy's sister, was doing her own searching. She had taken a leave from work and remained in Amy's apartment, sleeping in her sister's bed, breathing her air, trying to feel close to whatever pieces might remain. Grief hadn't settled fully yet. It clung at the edges, threatening to flood in, but for now, she was still in the space of waiting, of believing that if she just looked hard enough, Amy might reappear. One night, while sorting through an old box of photographs Amy had stored under her bed, Carla found a small blue notebook wrapped in a t-shirt from their childhood. The cover was worn, the pages inside filled with dense notes in Amy's tidy handwriting. It wasn't a diary, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more like a log. Each page referenced a different case, some dating back more than a decade. September 17, 1996, spoke to M. Hargrove. Confirms E. Fry had no reason to run away. Suspicious activity in apartment complex. Man in dark sedan parked behind dumpsters. Possibly same vehicle from D. Penn disappearance in '94. Carla's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. March 3, 1998. Received letter from M. She says she knows what happened to Joanna C. Will only talk in person. Cautious. Trust uncertain. She stopped there. Low, Carla whispered to herself. The next morning, she handed the notebook over to Curran and Rawlins. There's someone out there who spoke to her, Carla said. Voice steady but tight. Someone who gave her information about at least one of these cases. Curran carefully copied every note. The mention of L was the most intriguing. Amy had received a letter, possibly anonymous, claiming knowledge about the 1995 disappearance of Joanna Cardenas. She referred to the sender only as L, and no other names or initials were given. They checked Amy's mail logs, digital and physical. Nothing stood out. No known contacts with that initial. But something about the phrasing in Amy's note, trust uncertain, suggested Amy had taken the contact seriously, but cautiously. Later that week, another development. Curran received a call from a librarian in Franklin, who had worked there for over 30 years. She had seen Amy visit the library twice in the last 6 months, asking about newspaper archives from the late 1990s. Specifically, Amy had requested articles covering the disappearance of a man named Daniel Penn. Curran's interest sharpened. Daniel Penn had vanished in 1994, while working late at a gas station just outside Rentham. He was 26, engaged to be married, and disappeared during his shift. No security footage existed. His car, wallet and jacket were all left behind. At the time, it had been ruled a likely abduction, but no suspects were ever identified. Amy had been looking into Daniel Penn's disappearance alongside Joanna Cardenas and Ellis Fry. These were not random selections. She'd noticed something, some pattern, some common link, and she was circling in on it. Curran and Rawlins started compiling everything, timelines, locations, dates. They pinned a map to the wall and added colored flags for each disappearance. When they finished, a loose but discernible pattern emerged. A corridor of towns stretching from Franklin to Easton, with Rentham in the middle. All disappearances had occurred within this corridor, and all took place between the years 1992 and 1999. Then they made a second connection. All of the missing individuals had some link, however small, to a local psychiatric facility that had operated in the 1980s and early 1990s. Rentham State Hospital, long since closed and mostly torn down, had been the largest psychiatric institution in the area. It officially shut its doors in 1991, after a wave of lawsuits and state investigations into mismanagement and abuse. The buildings had sat abandoned for years, crumbling and surrounded by overgrown fields. A place children dared each other to explore after dark, but before its closure, it had housed thousands of patients, and dozens of doctors, nurses, and administrative staff. Curran tracked down the archived employee lists. It was a tedious process, full of misspelled names and incomplete records. But one name eventually jumped out at her. Leonard W. Fossey, a psychiatrist who had worked at Rentham State Hospital until its closure. After 1991, he vanished from professional records. No new license filings, no forwarding addresses, no academic publications, nothing. And yet on Amy's list of names, the 7th entry was simply LWF, retired, still in area. Curran sat in the empty silence of the police station, staring at that entry. Amy had found him, or at least had tried, and she had circled the initials LWF, just like she had circled Joanna Cardenas's name. The pieces were starting to align. The question now was what they pointed toward. Late one evening, Curran made her way to the outskirts of Rentham, to the remnants of the old hospital grounds. The moon was high and silver, casting ghostly light over broken pavement and rusting chain-link fences. Birds stirred in the distant trees. An old maintenance building still stood at the far edge of the property, boarded up but intact. According to tax records, the building and surrounding land were still owned by an anonymous trust, shielded behind layers of corporate anonymity. Curran suspected that if she peeled those layers back far enough, she'd find Dr. Leonard W. Fossey at the core. She shined her flashlight through the cracks in the boarded windows. Inside, dust and ruin, but also signs of recent disturbance: a coffee can, fresh cigarette butts, a mattress that didn't look decades old. Someone had been here recently. Back at the station, Rawlins was poring over the blue notebook again. There, in one of the final entries, Amy had scrawled something that now seemed terrifying in its clarity. He was always one step ahead. I think he sees me now. If I disappear, tell Carla not to stop. The others didn't run. They were taken. The weight of that final line echoed into silence. They were taken. Curran closed her eyes and tried to imagine Amy in those final days, alone with her knowledge, growing more certain of what she had uncovered, more afraid. And still she had pressed forward. The search for Amy Harper had evolved into something far greater than anyone had first imagined. What began as a missing persons investigation now hovered on the edge of something older and darker, a story that spanned decades, buried beneath layers of secrecy, silence, and time. Detective Joanna Curran felt that weight each time she revisited Amy's blue notebook, her fingertips brushing the ink like it might still be warm. Amy hadn't been a journalist. She hadn't been a police officer or private investigator. She was a school counselor, a woman who spent her days helping teenagers navigate grief, anxiety, and all the chaos of growing up. But somehow, she had pulled a thread that others had overlooked, and now that Curran had picked it up, she couldn't let go. Dr. Leonard W. Fossey remained the most compelling lead. Though his official records ended in 1991, hints of his presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of every page Amy had written. Her final entries suggested she had tracked him, maybe even spoken to him. And now she was gone. Curran reviewed what they knew. Leonard Fossey had been a psychiatrist at Rentham State Hospital for nearly a decade. He'd specialized in what was then called psychosocial rehabilitation, a blend of talk therapy, behavior modification, and pharmacological intervention. His name appeared in several patient incident reports from the late 1980s, but never as the direct subject of a complaint. Still, there were whispers. Nurses had remembered his odd hours, his sharp eyes, his unsettling ability to make patients calm without saying much at all. After the hospital shut down in 1991, Fossey had all but disappeared. There were no forwarding addresses, no professional references, just a fading name on an outdated staff roster, and a half-page resume in a forgotten archive. But that name kept coming up in Amy's notes. One entry, dated 6 months before her disappearance, read: Spoke Was/M Sheridan, former orderly at W.S. Ames Fossey, kept after-hours sessions. Select patients only. No records logged. Another just weeks later. LWF may have access to off-the-grid property. Possible cabin. Old hospital land. Investigate deeds. Curran followed the clue. In county land records, she found it a parcel of property, just outside Norfolk County, technically registered under a limited liability company formed in 1992, 1 year after the hospital's closure. The address on file matched the abandoned maintenance building she had visited weeks earlier. This time, she brought backup. At dawn, Curran and 2 officers returned to the structure under a low sky that threatened rain. The air smelled of moss and rust. Birds circled overhead. The building was still standing, its wood siding dark with years of rot, but the lock on the front door had been freshly changed. Inside, they found signs of use: cans of food, a cot, clothes hanging from a hook, and books stacked in neat piles. Psychology texts, journals, medical reference guides from the 1980s. No electricity. A small camp stove. A filing cabinet. Rusted but locked. They pried it open. Inside were folders. Many unlabeled, some marked with old Rentham State Hospital patient numbers. Curran flipped through them with gloved hands. Observations. Hand-drawn diagrams of patient behavior. One folder, near the back, was labeled simply H. She opened it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes about a woman named Evelyn Harper, Amy and Carla's mother. Curran froze. Evelyn had never been mentioned in connection to the hospital. In fact, her history was largely unremarkable. A local woman who'd worked in retail, raised 2 daughters, and died young of complications from a chronic illness. But here, on yellowed paper, was a record of psychiatric treatment from 1985 to 1987, listing Dr. Leonard Fossey as the attending physician. Amy had found this. She had uncovered that her mother had been a patient at Rentham. It explained so much. Her relentless digging, the secrecy, the urgency in her notes. She hadn't just been investigating strangers, she had been trying to understand her own history, and now she was gone. Curran closed the folder gently. They continued the search, and found no evidence of Amy inside the building. No blood, no clothing, no trace of her presence. But someone had been living here, recently. Curran made a quiet vow in that moment. She would find Amy, or whatever remained of her. She owed that much to a woman who had, without any badge or backing, merely unraveled a buried truth on her own. Back in town, Carla sat on the edge of Amy's bed, flipping through the last of the books her sister had been reading. A thin paperback tucked into the bookshelf caught her attention. It was a memoir, self-published, by a former psychiatric nurse named Helen Downey. The title was What They Didn't Let Us Say. Carla skimmed the index, and found several references to Rentham State Hospital. She read late into the night, under a yellow lamp, her hands trembling. One chapter in particular stood out. Downey described a physician referred to only as doctor, a man who had requested complete privacy for certain experimental sessions. She never witnessed any abuse, but she remembered the chilling quiet of the sessions. No records were allowed. No nurses permitted. Just Dr. F and his chosen patients. Downey's final line stayed with Carla. Some people see what they want to see in broken minds. Others see opportunity. The phrase haunted her. The next day Curran received an anonymous voicemail. The voice was male, quiet, and deliberately distorted. She knew too much. He warned her. She didn't stop. He's back. You're not ready. The line went dead. They traced the call to a payphone in Foxborough, 10 miles away. The area had no cameras, no witnesses, just another brick wall in a maze of disappearing trails. But someone out there was watching. Still, the case files grew, paper by paper. Amy's notes were now fully transcribed and digitized. Curran began assembling timelines. Evelyn Harper's treatment under Dr. Fossey, the disappearances that followed, Amy's discovery of her mother's history, her connection to those other missing names.
And now the real possibility that Fosse had never stopped his sessions, that his work had simply gone underground. Curran returned to the names on Amy's list. One stood out. Ellis Fry. Ellis had vanished in 1996, after leaving his job at a printing press. He was 31, quiet, a reader. But most notably, he had also been a patient at Rentham State Hospital in his teens, following a traumatic incident. Curran cross-referenced his case with others, and found two more similar patterns. At least 5 of the missing persons Amy had tracked had once been under psychiatric care at WSH. What Amy had uncovered was chilling. Someone had been targeting former patients. They were vulnerable, forgotten, people who had once been labeled and institutionalized, and who later disappeared with little public outcry. And the man who had once overseen their care may have orchestrated their erasure. Curran worked through the night. Her theory was taking shape. Leonard Fosse had continued his work in secret, whether under the guise of treatment, control, or something darker. He had isolated certain patients, and when the system dissolved, taken his methods with him. Amy had gotten too close. And then in the early hours of the morning, a call came in from a park ranger 2 counties west. They had found something. A shallow grave. Human remains. A wallet nearby, half buried under a rock. Inside was an ID. Amy Harper. Curran didn't speak for several seconds. She closed her eyes. The air in the office stilled. The recovery team moved quickly. Forensic analysts began the slow, delicate process of confirming the identity. The remains had been exposed to the elements for at least 2 weeks. Dental records would be necessary. Carla received the news with a soft, shuddering gasp, but no tears. Not yet. She was getting close. She whispered. She didn't fall. Someone pushed. Curran sat with her. Not as a detective, but as someone who had come to admire Amy's strength, her stubborn light. They both knew. This wasn't the end. Because if Amy had been silenced, it meant that Leonard Fosse was still out there, still watching, still choosing. The confirmation came just before sunset. The remains found in the shallow grave near Stone Hollow Park were conclusively identified as Amy Harper's. Dental records matched, as did the broken titanium pin in her left ankle, an old injury she had once mentioned in passing in her notes. It was over, but the end was anything but clean. The cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. The bones bore no clear trauma. No bullet holes. No blade marks. No fractures beyond the ones caused by time and weather. No signs of defensive wounds. There was evidence of animal activity, but that only complicated the timeline further. The forensic pathologist admitted what Detective Joanna Curran already knew. Amy had likely died of asphyxiation, exposure, or poisoning. But unless the killer had left a calling card, something specific and unambiguous, no cause would ever be definitive, just like the others. At the station, Curran spread Amy's files across the table. She lit a small desk lamp and let the yellow light fall over the pages like a final vigil. The pattern had emerged. 5 missing persons, all former patients, all unconnected on the surface. But deeper, beneath the dust and silence, was a thread. Leonard Fosse. He had vanished from public record, disappeared into a network of forgotten land deeds and unregistered companies. The cabin had been a clue, but there had to be more. Curran contacted the office of the State Psychiatric Licensing Board. A former colleague, Elena Wolfe, agreed to meet. Elena was in her 70s now, long retired, with a mind still sharp and a memory she called selectively photographic. She remembered Fosse. Brilliant man, once, she said. But cold. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. He was good at hiding. They met in her sunroom. Birds chattering outside in the late summer air. Curran showed her the notes, the hospital memos, even the folder labeled. Elena took her time. Fosse had theories, she said finally. Dangerous ones. He believed that trauma wasn't something to be healed. It was something to be reshaped. If you could control the mind at its most broken, you could rebuild it. or erase it. Curran felt a chill rise. He tested those theories on his patients. She asked. Elena looked away. We had suspicions, but no proof. Then the hospital closed, and he was gone. Curran left with one more name, a nurse who had worked closely with Fosse in the final years. Her name was Harriet Bellamy. Harriet lived in a care home outside Worcester. She had dementia now, slipping in and out of lucidity, but sometimes she spoke of the past. Curran made the visit. The nurse's room was small and neat. Pictures of her children on the dresser. A crocheted blanket folded across her knees. Her eyes were bright though distant. Curran introduced herself, gently explained who she was, and what she wanted to know. Harriet nodded slowly. Dr. Fosse. I remember him. Her voice was soft. Each sentence came with effort. He liked the quiet ones. The ones who didn't fight. Said they were easier to work with. Curran waited. He used music. Tapes. Said repetition changed the shape of memory. Like water smoothing stone. Harriet looked down at her hands. Some of them disappeared. We were told they were discharged. But no one ever came to pick them up. Their beds just stayed empty. Curran asked if she remembered any names. Harriet only said one. Evelyn. Amy's mother. Curran left the care home with a heavy heart. The final pieces were falling into place, but they formed a picture too blurred to prosecute. Fosse had worked in shadows, through methods that left no scars. He had chosen patients who would not be missed. And when the hospital closed, he had taken his work with him, into woods, basements, cabins, perhaps even into rented spaces where no one ever asked questions. And Amy had died trying to expose him. The district attorney was reluctant to proceed without stronger evidence. No living witnesses. No confession. No clear cause of death. It wasn't enough. But Curran wasn't ready to close the file. Instead she turned to what she did have. Amy's notes. Her insights. Her methods. She started with the fifth name on the list. Wallace Greer. Last seen in 2004. No known family. Formerly institutionalized at Renton. Curran traced Wallace to a homeless shelter in Lowell, where he had lived under the name David for 3 years. He'd vanished after one night in 2004. But a social worker remembered something strange. He told me someone was coming for him, she said. Said the doctor was back. I thought he was delusional. Curran asked if he had left anything behind. A single locker unopened for years. Held a canvas bag. Inside a small notebook. A cassette tape. And a photograph.
The photograph was old, creased and faded. It showed a group of patients in the Wrentham courtyard. 5 faces circled in pen. One of them was Evelyn Harper. On the back of the photo, a message in trembling handwriting. He doesn't forget. He finds you. Even when you're clean. The cassette tape was labeled simply Session 6. Curran took it to the crime lab. They digitized the tape. The audio was faint, muffled by age and background hiss. But a voice came through, calm, measured. This is Dr. Fosse. Session 6. Subject displays improved responsiveness to auditory cues. Trauma imagery integration proceeding. There was a pause. Then a second voice. Female, trembling. I don't want to remember. Fosse's voice again. You already do. We're just helping you reshape it. Curran listened, hands shaking. The tape was damning. It confirmed the therapy sessions were real. That memory manipulation had taken place, and that Fosse had continued his methods outside the bounds of legal medicine. But still, it wasn't enough for a conviction. The law needed a body, a statement, a date, a place. Curran had only echoes, so instead she did what Amy had done. She wrote. She compiled everything. She reconstructed the timelines, the names, the notes. She filed a full 200-page report with the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the state's Attorney General. She submitted copies to journalists, advocacy groups, and survivor networks. And she added one final piece, Amy's journal, unedited. The story went public within days. Unlicensed psychiatrist tied to cold case deaths, abandoned hospital, School counselor's disappearance uncovers decades of patient abuse. Amy Harper's final investigation. The forgotten voices of Wrentham. The press coverage did what the courts could not. An independent task force was formed to investigate historical abuse at Wrentham State Hospital. New records were unsealed. Families of missing persons came forward. A former groundskeeper admitted to transporting patients off-site without formal documentation. And then, 3 months later, a man matching Leonard Foss's description was seen in New Hampshire, living under the name Daniel Lowe. By the time investigators arrived, the cabin was empty. Inside they found walls covered with notes, journals, maps, diagrams, a dozen cassette tapes, and on a table, a single photograph. Amy Harper, standing outside Wrentham's iron gate, holding a file to her chest. Someone had taken it without her knowing. Someone had been watching her for a long time. The cabin yielded no fingerprints, no DNA, but the message was clear. He had been there. He knew the net was closing, and then he was gone again, but not forgotten. Amy Harper's name became part of local history, taught in ethics classes, cited in legal debates about psychiatric reform. A scholarship fund was created in her name for students studying mental health advocacy. Carla continued her sister's work quietly, speaking to survivors, collecting their stories, adding pages to the ledger Amy had started. And in the archives of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, the final report sat on the shelf. 4 volumes, 4 names, 4 silent disappearances, and one woman who refused to let silence win. In the end, the truth wasn't a headline. It wasn't a courtroom drama, or a single moment of justice served. It was quieter than that. It was a notebook, a trail, a name, Amy Harper, and a sister, a detective, and a town that finally learned to listen. In the quiet western edge of North Carolina, nestled in the dense hills of Burke County, the woods stretch wide and silent. The landscape is rugged, with deep gullies, winding streams, and a forest canopy that casts long shadows even in daylight. It was a place of isolation and beauty, perfect for those looking to disappear or those hoping not to be found. On October 9th, 2000, a 911 call came in just after 3:30 a.m. from a frantic man named Barry Hinson. His niece, a 23-year-old woman named Asha Degree, was missing. She'd been staying at his house in Morganton while attending nearby Western Piedmont Community College. He said she had left sometime in the night. Her shoes were gone, but her purse, phone, and all her personal belongings remained. There was no note, no signs of forced entry, no noise, just absence. When deputies from the Burke County Sheriff's Office arrived at the small brick house, they found little to go on. The door had been locked. No signs of a struggle. Asha's bed was neatly made, and her textbooks were stacked beside it. Her wallet still held her ID. Her car keys hung on the hook, near the back door. It was as though she had simply vanished. Barry told investigators he had fallen asleep on the couch and woke up at 2:45 a.m. to use the bathroom. Asha's bedroom door was closed, but by 3:15 a.m., when he passed by again, the door was wide open and the room was empty. Asha Degree wasn't the type to run off. By all accounts, she was quiet and responsible, devoted to her studies, close with her family, and driven to become a teacher. Her professors at the college described her as punctual, soft-spoken, and incredibly polite. Her mother, Angela, said she had always been cautious and deeply rooted in her routines. The timing of her disappearance was strange. Asha had recently withdrawn from her fall semester classes, citing stress and fatigue. But she told her mother she planned to re-enroll in the spring. She had no boyfriend, no known enemies, and no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. Within 24 hours, local law enforcement had begun combing the woods behind Barry's house, sending dogs and volunteers through the underbrush. Helicopters flew overhead. Nothing turned up. Not a single item of clothing, no footprints, no indication of which direction she'd gone. It was as though she had been swallowed by the dark. Sheriff's deputies expanded the search grid. They looked through the creek beds, searched abandoned buildings, and checked in with known offenders in the area. Still, the trail stayed cold. No one reported seeing Asha that night. There were no surveillance cameras, no ATM transactions, no calls made from her phone. Then, on the third day, a man named Robert Finch came forward. He lived in a rural cabin off Highway 126 and claimed that early Monday morning, around 4 a.m., he saw a young woman walking along the roadside, barefoot and wearing what looked like pajamas. She had long black hair and looked disoriented. He thought she was sleepwalking. He slowed down but didn't stop. She looked right at me, he told the sheriff's office, like she was expecting someone else. The lead reignited the search, this time focused near the stretch of highway Robert mentioned. They found no trace of Asha, but they did find something else. A single black flip-flop, caught in the roots of a tree down an embankment. It didn't belong to Asha. It was several sizes too large. Still, its placement raised questions. Had someone been there watching? Had someone followed her, or worse, had she been led there? Over the next few weeks, the case turned from a search into something more anxious and silent. The media reported it as a missing person case, but behind closed doors, the sheriff's department began treating it as suspicious. Something about the whole scene was too neat, too quiet. Then came the notebooks. Angela Degree was going through her daughter's desk at home when she found a set of journals. Inside were dozens of handwritten entries, some going back more than a year. Asha had never mentioned keeping a diary. The entries were orderly, dated, and deeply personal. At first, they seemed ordinary reflections about school, her family, her dreams. But as Angela read further, she noticed something strange. Starting in June, the tone shifted. Asha began referencing someone she called the Quiet One. The entries became more fragmented. The Quiet One waits for me. He doesn't talk much, but he always knows when I'm alone. He says I'm different from the others. That I'm awake, not like them. Sometimes I feel like he's already here. Like he's behind the door, just watching. Angela brought the journals to Detective Laura Whitman, the lead investigator on the case. Whitman had suspected for days that Asha's disappearance was not a random act. The journals confirmed what she feared. Someone had been manipulating Asha. But who? There were no signs of grooming online. Asha's computer showed no social media accounts, no chat logs, no messages that hinted at a predator. She used her email for class assignments. She had no known pseudonyms or secret accounts. Yet the journals told a different story. Detective Whitman brought in a forensic psychologist to review the entries. The analysis was inconclusive but troubling. It seemed likely that Asha had created the Quiet One as a metaphor or dissociative identity, a way of expressing fear or detachment. But it was also possible, the psychologist warned, that someone had encouraged her to write those entries, perhaps even dictated what to say. The most recent journal entry was dated October 8th, the day before she vanished. He says tomorrow is the time, that I'll understand everything when I get there. The entry ended with a single line underlined twice. Don't forget the light. Bring the candle. There was no candle found in her room, but a box of long matches had gone missing from the kitchen. In the coming days, the town of Morganton pulled tighter around the case. Rumors spread. Some whispered that Asha had joined a cult. Others believed she had taken her own life. The sheriff's office dismissed both, though quietly. They could not rule anything out. The woods remained mute. Every search ended the same way, with nothing. By mid-November, the official investigation had slowed. Leads dried up. The house on Winding Hollow Lane, where Barry still lived, stood quiet, its porch light always on, just in case she came back. Then in December, something surfaced. About 12 miles west, near the Lake James shoreline, a hunter stumbled upon a collapsed lean-to covered in brush. Inside was a tarp, a rusted lantern, and a piece of red cloth, possibly from a shirt or dress. Nearby, wedged between two rocks, was a torn notebook page. Written in pencil, the page held a brief message. It's not what you think. I didn't leave alone. Forensic testing was inconclusive. The handwriting bore similarities to Asha's, but the water damage made a definitive match impossible. The page was found less than 2 miles from where Robert Finch had reported seeing the young woman on the highway. Detective Whitman now believed that Asha had met someone, either online, at school or somewhere else entirely, who had cultivated her trust, possibly over months. Someone who convinced her to leave willingly, under some shared fantasy or philosophy. The term "the Quiet One" may have been a symbolic title, used to control her psychologically. But whether she had left of her own accord, or was taken, remained a haunting unknown. The woods held their silence, and somewhere beneath those trees, the rest of the story was waiting. By early January 2001, Burke County had grown quieter, more hushed beneath the weight of a mystery that had not gone away. The public face of the investigation into Asha Degree's disappearance was now subdued, but behind closed doors, Detective Laura Whitman remained persistent. Files covered her office walls, maps, photographs, interview transcripts, timelines. The case had slipped from headlines, but not from her mind. She reread the final journal entries often. They had a kind of rhythm, a cadence that made her uneasy. Phrases repeated. The quiet one, the candle, the light, tomorrow. Whitman had worked with missing persons cases before, but something about this one felt both intimately personal and oddly orchestrated. The note discovered near the lean-to at Lake James, stating, "It's not what you think. I didn't leave alone," had re-centered the case. While its authenticity couldn't be confirmed, it matched what Whitman feared, that Asha hadn't simply walked into the woods to disappear. She'd been guided there. She refocused her efforts on Asha's past 6 months. Somewhere, she believed, someone had been speaking to the girl, maybe in person, maybe through the library, or through college circles. Perhaps a professor, or a fellow student. Whitman began methodically interviewing every instructor at Western Piedmont Community College, even those Asha had only briefly interacted with. Most remembered her fondly, soft-spoken, attentive, respectful. No one described any unusual behavior. But when she reached Dr. Vincent Harrow, a retired philosophy professor who had taught an ethics seminar that Asha briefly attended before withdrawing, something finally struck a different note. Dr. Harrow lived alone, on a small property south of Morganton. A widower, well into his 70s, he welcomed Whitman with quiet hospitality. His study was lined with books, ancient texts, theological volumes, works on mysticism and metaphysics. He was a man clearly steeped in ideas. He claimed to barely remember Asha at first. She sat in the back, he said, peering through round glasses. Only came to a few sessions. Polite girl, not particularly outspoken. But then he paused, as if reconsidering. I do recall, he added, one essay. We had a brief exchange. She submitted a reflection on Descartes and the nature of reality. It was unusually personal. She wrote about dreams and waking inside them. He offered to find it in his records, but claimed it was likely discarded when he retired. Still, Whitman made note of it. Asha had never spoken of philosophy. Her journals never mentioned metaphysics or abstract theory. It seemed out of place, unless, of course, she had been drawn to the subject for a reason. That night, Whitman returned to the station and re-examined the contents of Asha's journals. She was looking not for content this time, but for patterns, specific phrases, rhythms of language, repetitions. One phrase had always stood out. The quiet one says, I must prepare. That only those who sleep without dreams can wake to the truth. She ran the phrase through a database of known writings and obscure texts. To her surprise, a similar sentence appeared in a self-published book of fringe philosophy, titled Through the Veil, Essays on the Inner World, written in 1979, by none other than Vincent Harrow. The passage read, The veil is thin for those who do not dream, for they walk already among the truths of the hidden world. To prepare for that crossing, one must learn to listen, not to voices, but to silence. For silence is where the quiet one speaks. The echo was too precise to ignore. Whitman returned to Harrow's home the next day, without calling ahead. The elderly professor seemed surprised, but not alarmed.
She presented the page from his book, and the entry from Arsha's journal. "You told me you barely remembered her," Whitman said. Harrow looked at the papers, then back at her, eyes settling into something quieter. "I don't know what you think I did," he said evenly. "But I didn't lead that girl into the woods. If she read my work, it was not through me. That book is nearly 25 years out of print." Whitman had no warrant, no cause to push further. She left, but her suspicions deepened. She requested a full background check on Harrow, his former students, travel history, even unpublished writings. Meanwhile, she pulled Arsha's library records, and found something else. Between July and October of 2000, Arsha had borrowed several books through interlibrary loan. Among them was Harrow's Through the Veil, one of only 4 known copies in the state, borrowed from Appalachian State University. Another was Rites of Initiation, historical contexts of occult societies. None of the books were overdue. She had returned each one on time. Back in Morganton, Arsha's mother Angela had been quietly dealing with her own leads. She had received 3 anonymous letters since November, all handwritten in careful script, each postmarked from Raleigh, each containing only one sentence. The key was never hers. Angela brought the letters to Whitman's attention. Fingerprints and DNA yielded no results. But Whitman noticed something peculiar. The envelopes were postmarked the same day of the week, always Tuesday, and always from the same postal code. She reached out to Raleigh police for assistance canvassing the area. Weeks passed. Then a breakthrough. A patrol officer in Raleigh, named Elena Ross, spotted a man mailing a letter in the exact postbox where the mysterious notes had been dropped. She approached him, not accusing, just curious. He was nervous, evasive. When pressed, he admitted to mailing letters on behalf of someone else, a man who paid him $20 per envelope. They had met at a used bookstore, he said, and the man had been very clear. No questions, no names. The man he described was tall, thin, white, with prematurely grey hair, and a quiet voice, possibly in his 50s. He wore a navy coat with suede elbow patches. Whitman's blood ran cold. That matched Vincent Harrow almost exactly. The man who'd mailed the letters didn't know where his employer lived, but led officers to the bookstore. The owner, an aging woman named Dolores, recognized the description instantly. "Oh, that's Mr. Keller," she said. "Been coming in here for years. Always buys the same kind of books. Old theology, mysticism, Gnostic stuff." The name Keller had not come up before. Whitman pulled records. There was no Vincent Keller in the DMV database for that area, but there was one in Tennessee. More interestingly, Vincent Harrow's middle name was Keller. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was enough to shadow him. Meanwhile, Whitman returned to the woods near Lake James. She requested a drone scan of the terrain around the lean-to. On aerial footage, analysts spotted something odd, an indentation in the earth, rectangular, about 80 yards northeast of the structure. Not natural. Excavation revealed a sealed plastic container, buried beneath layers of pine needles and soil. Inside were 2 candles, both unused, a blank cassette tape, and a set of photographs, blurry, nighttime images, most likely Polaroids, showing dense woods and faint light. But the most chilling item was the final photo. It was of Arsha. Her face was partially illuminated by candlelight. She was looking at the camera, her expression calm but distant, almost entranced. She appeared unharmed, sitting cross-legged on what looked like a stone surface. On the back of the photo was a message, written in red ink. "She is further now, but she's not lost." The handwriting matched the anonymous letters. The discovery broke the case open in a new direction, not only confirming that Arsha had been alive after her disappearance, but suggesting she had been part of something longer, stranger, and perhaps willingly, at least in the beginning. Back in Morganton, the Degree family had no answers, only hope, sharpened by grief. Arsha's room remained untouched. Her mother placed a fresh candle on the windowsill each night. For the first time in months, Detective Whitman felt they were approaching the center of the maze, but what they would find there, whether redemption or something far darker, remained uncertain. The third week of February brought with it a rare hush in Morganton. Snow had dusted the town's rooftops during the night, and the world outside seemed quieter than usual. But for Detective Laura Whitman, the case of Asha Degree was far from still. If anything, it had reached a new and unsettling momentum. The photograph found near Lake James, Asha seated calmly in candlelight, had fractured the timeline. Until that moment, her fate had been cloaked in darkness and absence. Now Whitman had to accept that Asha had been alive for some time after she vanished. Perhaps she still was. But that notion came with thorns. If Asha had lived, then someone had kept her hidden. Someone had led her into silence, and away from her family. And that someone had left clues behind. Photos, notes, phrases, all cryptic and calculated. It wasn't the work of a spontaneous crime. This had been planned, cultivated. And whoever had done it believed they were on a mission. Whitman reread the red-inked message from the back of the photo. She is further now. But she's not lost. The phrase didn't speak to murder. It spoke to transformation, or at least the illusion of it. That disturbed her more deeply than any violence might have. Because it meant someone believed they were rescuing Asha, not harming her. She arranged for a forensic handwriting analyst to compare the photo message, the letters to Angela, and excerpts from Harrow's known writings. The results came back with high likelihood of a match. Vincent Harrow, or someone mimicking him closely, had likely written every one of them, but the professor was cautious. Elusive. There were no fingerprints on the photo, the box or even the candles. The container had been wiped clean. Someone knew how to leave a trail without being followed. Still, Whitman pressed forward. She requested a formal interview with Harrow, this time through official channels. He agreed, showing up at the police station wearing a wool coat, a scarf, and a small placid smile. He brought nothing with him, no lawyer, no bag, no visible concern. "I've already told you everything I remember," he said, folding his hands neatly on the table. Whitman didn't respond at first. She laid out a photo of Asha in candlelight before him. His expression didn't change. She asked calmly, "Where was this taken?" "I wouldn't know," he said. "But you wrote this, didn't you?" She pressed, tapping the red ink on the back of the photo. He looked at the writing, leaned in slightly, and then met her eyes. "No," he said evenly. "But it's a beautiful sentiment, isn't it?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Why did Asha quote your book in her journal?" Whitman asked. "She was a bright girl. Perhaps she found it on her own. You were one of the only people in this state with access to that book. Perhaps, but I never gave it to her." She paused, then added, "We have a witness who says you used the name Mr. Keller. That's your middle name, isn't it?" Harrow smiled gently. "It's a common name." Whitman knew she was speaking to a wall, but a carefully constructed one, built brick by brick out of control and self-delusion. That evening, she sat alone in her office and replayed the tape of the interview. There was something in his tone. He wasn't scared. He wasn't taunting either. It was as if he genuinely believed what he said, as though Asha had gone somewhere better, that she had ascended. The language of cults is rarely direct. It thrives in metaphor and abstraction, but underneath it all is the same structure, an authority figure who offers meaning, and followers who surrender to it. Whitman began searching for other names connected to Harrow, students who had studied under him, particularly those who had vanished or retreated from public life. One name surfaced: Naomi Henders, a former student who dropped out halfway through Harrow's ethics seminar in 1994. No clear reason given, no forwarding address. Further digging revealed that Naomi had changed her name 2 years later, and moved to a remote town in the Appalachians. She now went by Ruth Elkins and lived in quiet seclusion, rarely engaging with neighbors. Whitman drove there herself, through winding roads and heavy mist. The house was set back behind a curtain of pines. Simple, untouched. A wind chime tinkled faintly on the porch. Ruth answered the door slowly. She was in her early 40s now, with sharp eyes and cautious posture. When Whitman introduced herself and explained her reason for visiting, Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The house was clean but sparse. Books lined the walls. A small candle burned on the table. Whitman noticed a photograph of a girl on the mantel, a girl about Asha's age, but not Asha. Ruth's daughter, perhaps. I left all that behind, Ruth said after a long silence. Harrow's teachings. His circle. It took me years. Whitman leaned forward. So you were part of something? Yes, Ruth admitted. But it wasn't a cult. Not exactly. It was a way of thinking. He believed there were two realities, the visible and the hidden. He taught us to peel back the layers. Did he ever mention the quiet one? Ruth's face twitched. Yes, she said softly. That was what he called the voice that speaks when you're truly silent. When the ego is gone. Did he ever encourage students to disappear? No. But he liked when they did. Whitman paused. What does that mean? It made him feel he was reaching them. That they were finally surrendering their illusions. Ruth stood and walked to a drawer. She retrieved a small journal, worn with age. I kept this from that time. Not much. But maybe something in here can help. Whitman took it. Pages were filled with fragments of thought, quotes from Harrow, and repeated dreams. On one page in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She walks between, the quiet one has taken her further." It echoed the note found in the box near the lake. Whitman returned to Morganton that night, feeling more certain than ever. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was an ideology, a belief system with its own scripture, shepherded by a man who had once commanded quiet devotion. But Harrow wasn't acting alone. That much she was sure of. He was too careful, too protected. Someone had helped move Asha, possibly multiple people. Maybe even women like Ruth, before they broke away. Asha's mother, Angela, was informed of the new findings. She asked only one question. Is she still alive? Whitman had no answer. But late one night, 2 weeks after returning from the mountains, a package arrived at the police station. No return address. Inside was a VHS tape. Unmarked. Whitman tracked down the last functioning tape deck in the department, called in a technician, and sat down to watch it. The footage was grainy, black and white, clearly filmed in low light. It showed the interior of a wooden structure, a cabin or small room. A single candle burned in the center, and then slowly, a figure entered the frame. Asha. Her hair was longer now, her face slightly thinner, but she was alive. She knelt before the candle, closed her eyes and whispered something inaudible. Then the screen faded to black. That was it. There was no audio, no context, no location, but she was alive. Or had been. Recently. The tape changed everything. Whitman had a visual, a time-stamped record. The case was reclassified. The FBI was re-engaged. The media returned, though gently now tempered by time. In her bedroom, Angela Degree wept for the first time in months. Not in despair, but in recognition. Her daughter had not been lost to violence, but to belief. And belief can be more dangerous than any weapon, because it asks its followers, not just to obey, but to vanish willingly. The video had changed everything. For 15 years, Asha Degree had lived in photographs, in speculation, in the aching gap of unanswered questions, but now in a grainy flicker of black and white, she had returned, not physically, but undeniably. She knelt in candlelight, as still and silent as the day she vanished, and though her mouth moved, her voice never reached the recording. That silence echoed far louder than anything she might have said. Detective Laura Whitman sat in her office long after the others had gone home. The VHS tape, now carefully digitized, had become the centerpiece of a new phase in the investigation. FBI analysts worked to dissect every detail. The type of wood paneling in the room, the candle itself, the clothing she wore. The date stamp had been obscured, possibly deliberately, but a faint corner of the image showed a calendar on the wall. The month was September. The year was 2004, 4 years after Asha vanished. Whitman pushed back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The implications weighed heavily. Asha had not been taken and killed. She had been held, or worse, guided into an alternate life, carefully shaped and maintained away from the eyes of the world. Asha's parents sat in stunned quiet when they saw the video. Angela pressed her fingers to the screen, whispering her daughter's name, as if her voice might cross time and technology to reach her. Harold stood still, blinking back tears, nodding softly. "She's older," he whispered. "But it's her. She's still." But questions flooded the space left by Hope. Who filmed her? Where had she been taken? Why had she remained hidden for so long? And why now? Why send the video? The tape had been mailed from Richmond, Virginia. Surveillance footage from a post office showed only a hooded figure dropping the package into the mail chute. No clear identification, no traceable fingerprints on the envelope. But inside, along with the tape, was a note typed on plain paper. "She is almost ready." That message changed the tone. What had once been assumed as abduction now resembled indoctrination. Asha had not been held against her will in a traditional sense. She had been prepared for what no one yet understood. Whitman returned to Ruth Elkins, formerly Naomi Henders, and asked the question she had previously hesitated to voice. If someone took Asha, and they believed they were helping her, what were they preparing her for? Ruth didn't speak at first. She walked to the window and stared into the Appalachian fog. Finally, she said, "Harrow believed the world was split into 3 layers. The seen, the unseen, and the sacred. The sacred could only be reached through silence and surrender. He believed children were closest to that threshold." Whitman felt a chill rise in her chest. "Are you saying he targeted children?" Ruth turned. "No, not in the way you're thinking. He didn't hurt them. At least I never saw him do that. But he believed that by guiding a child into the sacred layer, they could become something else, something pure. A vessel, maybe." Whitman asked, "Did he ever say what would happen when they were ready?" Ruth's lips tightened. "He said they would walk back into the world, and we wouldn't recognize them, because they'd become more than who they were." Back in Morganton, Whitman organized a task force to begin mapping Harrow's known associates. Several former students were found to have changed names, moved to rural areas, or gone entirely off the grid. One of them, Elliot Vaughn, had lived in Virginia during the time the tape was mailed. Another, Maureen Crest, had worked briefly as a caregiver in a home for troubled youth in North Carolina during the early 2000s. There were no direct connections to Asha, but the patterns were clear: isolation, reinvention, and continued ideological alignment with Harrow's beliefs. Then came a break, neither expected nor fully understood. A second package arrived. This time, it was addressed directly to Asha's mother. Angela opened it slowly at the police station, hands trembling. Inside was a journal. The cover was handmade, fabric over cardboard, stitched with care. The first few pages were blank, but then in a familiar looping cursive, came a single line: "I remember now." Whitman took the journal and read each page aloud, while Angela and Harold sat beside her. It became clear, slowly, heartbreakingly, that Asha had written these entries. She detailed waking up in a quiet house after the night she disappeared. A woman never named told her she was chosen, that the world was full of noise and danger, and she had been spared. For months she was not allowed to speak. She was taught meditation, silence, rituals she didn't understand. There were books, but only certain ones. No clocks, no mirrors, no electronics. She was always accompanied, never alone, yet isolated in the deepest sense. One entry read, "Sometimes I dream of my mother's voice. I forget the words, but I feel her warmth. I know I came from somewhere else. I know I had a name before this."
Another entry. Later, I've begun to speak again. Only sometimes. Only when the quiet one allows it. The final page bore a short message. They said, I will go back soon, but I don't know where back is. I'm afraid I've changed too much. Whitman stared at the page, long after the others had gone. The journal proved that Asha was alive, at least as recently as the year before. But it also proved something deeper, that whoever had taken her had sought to erase her past and replace it with something entirely new. They hadn't just abducted her body, they had tried to transform her mind. The journal also hinted at multiple people involved. The use of they confirmed what Whitman had suspected all along. Harrow may have been the architect, but others had done the building. Authorities issued renewed warrants, re-interviewed former students, and traced financial records connected to Harrow's university years. One account showed regular monthly withdrawals sent to a cabin rental service in eastern Tennessee, near a stretch of dense forest. It was remote, isolated, perfect for secrecy. When they arrived, the cabin had been abandoned. Inside were empty shelves, neatly folded blankets, and a single white candle on the table. But in the drawer of a nightstand, they found a photograph. Asha, again, older this time, perhaps 17, standing beside a creek, barefoot, staring into the trees. On the back, one final message: she is ready now. The photo bore a timestamp, just 3 months earlier. Authorities launched a full-scale search of the region. Drones, dogs, and teams of trained specialists combed the woods. They found faint trails, discarded wrappers, remnants of recent fire pits, but no sign of Asha. The sightings that followed were inconsistent. Whispers from hikers, distant shapes seen in morning mist, a girl buying fruit at a roadside stand and vanishing before police arrived. But Whitman believed she was out there. In a press briefing, she addressed the public, gently, carefully. We have reason to believe that Asha Degree is alive and living under a new identity. We ask that anyone who may have seen her, or who recognizes the face in these updated images, contact us immediately. She may be disoriented. She may not respond to her original name, but she is not lost. Angela and Harold were present, but did not speak. Their pain remained immense, but it now coexisted with a strange, unfamiliar hope. For weeks afterward, tips flowed in. Each was reviewed, followed, categorized, but none led to her. And then, silence returned. A season passed, leaves fell in Morganton, frost painted the edges of windows. Life, though fragile, went on. Asha's room remained untouched. Asha herself remained somewhere in the space between memory and myth. A girl raised in silence. A child taught to forget her name. A teenager who wrote, "I remember now," as a sign that something deep inside had endured. Whitman, nearing retirement, often wondered whether they would ever truly find her, or if Asha would one day return on her own, stepping out of the mist, uncertain but alive. In her final report, Whitman wrote, "Some disappearances end in tragedy, some in resolution, and some in a long, slow unfolding of a truth too complex to name. Asha Degree's case remains open, not because we failed to find her, but because she is still becoming." And in a quiet room in a distant town, a young woman lit a candle and stared into the flame. Her hands trembled as they hovered above a notebook. Then she began to write. The road to Athens, Vermont, is a quiet one. It winds through dense woods, small farms, and sloping hills, each season changing its character, but never its quiet. It is a town where people know each other by name, where barns lean gently with age and mailboxes are repainted instead of replaced. And on a still October morning in 2010, it became the center of a mystery that has never found its final page. Kristen Lowery was 32 years old when she vanished. She had moved to Athens from Hartford 6 years earlier, hoping for a slower life after the stress of a divorce. She settled into a small white farmhouse at the edge of town, with lilac bushes in the yard and a gravel driveway that curved like a question mark. She worked part-time at the general store and took art classes in Bellows Falls. She was quiet, solitary, but kind, known for her gentle voice and the way she remembered people's birthdays. On Friday, October 8th, Kristen spoke with her sister Maureen by phone. It was a short call, just a check-in. Maureen would later recall that Kristen sounded tired, but not troubled. She said she was working on a new painting and that the leaves had just started to turn gold behind the house. "I'll send you a picture once I'm done," she said. "It's starting to feel like fall here." That was the last time anyone heard from her. On Monday morning, Kristen didn't show up for her shift at the store. Her co-worker, Elise, assumed she might be sick. But when she didn't answer her phone or respond to messages by Tuesday, Elise drove out to the farmhouse to check on her. Kristen's car was in the driveway. The porch light was still on, though the morning sun had long risen. A single pumpkin sat by the front steps, half carved. Elise knocked and called her name, peering through the glass. Inside, she saw Kristen's canvas propped against an easel, the painting unfinished. There was a mug on the windowsill, half full of tea, now cold. Elise called the sheriff. By that afternoon, Deputy Ron Moore and 2 state troopers were walking the perimeter of Kristen's property. The doors were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. The living room was neat, the dishes done, her wallet and keys on the kitchen counter. Her phone, however, was missing. There were no signs of a struggle. The farmhouse stood still, as if Kristen had simply walked out the door and never returned. When Maureen arrived the next day, she told deputies that Kristen had never been spontaneous. She didn't take trips without planning them. She didn't disappear without saying something. She wasn't happy all the time, Maureen said softly. But she wasn't unstable. She was finding her way again. Search teams scoured the woods behind the farmhouse. A narrow trail led down to a shallow brook where Kristen often painted. They found a chair, sun-bleached and slightly warped, and an old thermos empty. But no footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They picked up no scent. Posters went up across Windham County. Local news covered the story with solemn urgency. "Athens woman vanishes without a trace," the headlines read. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of a gentle woman who'd become part of the quiet rhythm of the town. The mystery unsettled people. There was no storm, no warning, no explanation, just a vanishing. Detective Claire Merrill from the Vermont State Police Missing Persons Unit took over the case. She was in her early 40s, with a practiced patience and the ability to ask hard questions softly. She began by revisiting the last known days of Kristen's life, cross-referencing timelines and searching for any digital traces. Kristen's phone last pinged a tower 7 miles northeast of her home, around 9:18 p.m., on the night she went missing. The signal then disappeared entirely, shut off or destroyed. No activity on her bank accounts. No social media posts. No emails. Detective Merrill reviewed surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and rest stops. In Bellows Falls, about 15 minutes from Athens, a blurry clip showed a woman resembling Kristen at a gas station that same Friday night. She was wearing a dark coat and appeared to be alone, walking quickly. But the footage was inconclusive. The case deepened when a man named Russell Kemp came forward. He lived in a cabin near the trailhead that led into the woods behind Kristen's home. He told Merrill he had seen someone walking through the woods that night, just after 9. Too far to make out, he said. But it wasn't her usual route. And whoever it was, they were carrying something. Merrill asked if it was a flashlight. No, he said. Something heavier. Like a bag. When pressed, he admitted he couldn't say for certain that it was Kristen. But it was enough to warrant further search. The woods behind Russell's cabin were thick with maple and spruce, scattered with old logging roads and overgrown paths. The search expanded. Volunteers combed the forest, flagging potential leads, finding nothing. As weeks passed, theories emerged. Some believed Kristen had gone into the woods to take her own life. Others were convinced she had left to start over, shedding her past in search of a new identity. But those who knew her, Maureen Elise, her art instructor in Bellows Falls, insisted this didn't match the woman they knew. She wasn't running from anything, Elise said. She was building something. A few days after Halloween, something unusual happened. A package arrived at the Athens post office, addressed to the artist of the white farmhouse. Inside was a manila envelope containing 6 photographs, each one of Kristen's paintings. Only these versions were different. In each photograph, a shadowy figure had been painted into the corner, sometimes just a silhouette behind a tree, sometimes a face in a window, each one placed with precise unease. There was no note. The paintings were ones Kristen had worked on during the past year, but none of them had ever been publicly displayed. No copies existed. The only originals had been inside her home, and yet these versions had been altered. Merrill returned to the farmhouse. The paintings were still there, untouched. But when examined closely, something was found that had been missed the first time. Faint impressions, almost invisible, were present on the backs of 2 canvases. Letters written in pencil, nearly erased. "He comes before the silence." It was a phrase that meant little on its own, but it suggested that someone had been watching Kristen, perhaps even entering her home. Without a struggle, without a sound, Merrill began looking at Kristen's past more closely. She learned that during her divorce, Kristen had filed a restraining order against her ex-husband, Daniel Rhodes, citing emotional manipulation and stalking. But the order had expired 2 years earlier. Daniel lived in Massachusetts now, with a new partner. He denied any contact with Kristen in years. His alibi for the weekend she vanished was confirmed. He had been visiting his brother in upstate New York. Phone records supported it. Still, something about the phrase nagged at Merrill. "He comes before the silence." Had Kristen been leaving clues? Or had someone else planted those words? Back in the cabin by the woods, Russell Kemp was arrested on unrelated charges, unlicensed firearms found in his home. During a search, officers found a notebook hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were drawings, charcoal sketches. Some were crude landscapes. Others showed women in the woods, always alone, always watched. One sketch resembled Kristen, the same curve of her jaw, the same long hair, and beside her, a shadowy shape that loomed just out of reach. Russell refused to speak. He was eventually released, and though suspicion clung to him, no evidence tied him directly to Kristen's disappearance. The mystery endured. Winter came, blanketing Athens in silence. Kristen's home remained untouched, her porch light eventually replaced by Maureen, who continued to visit each month. The unfinished painting still sat on the easel. The tea in the mug had evaporated, but her presence lingered like breath on a mirror, faint but impossible to wipe away. Some believed she had been taken. Others whispered that she had walked into the forest on her own. But Detective Merrill, ever patient, kept one thing pinned to her wall above the case file. A photograph of Kristen Lowery, smiling faintly in morning light, paint on her hands. And beneath it, written in Merrill's neat handwriting, "She did not leave without a trace. We just haven't learned how to see it yet." In the early days of November, as frost began to cling to the high grass and wood smoke curled from chimneys across Athens, Vermont, the search for Kristen Lowery slowed, but it did not stop. Detective Claire Merrill kept the case active, even as other priorities crept into her schedule. Some colleagues said it was time to scale back the effort. No new leads had surfaced. The woods had been searched and researched. If Kristen had wanted to be found, one officer murmured, she would have been by now, but Claire didn't share that view. She had handled dozens of disappearances in her 15 years with the Vermont State Police, and while many had been cut and dry runaways, domestic disputes, hikers gone too far off trail, this case felt different. It was quiet, yes, deceptively so, but something about Kristen's story refused to fade, and Claire had learned to trust that feeling. At the farmhouse, the lights remained off. The utilities had been transferred to Maureen, who refused to sell the home. She could still come back. Maureen would say when asked, "I want her to come back to something that feels like home." She often spent weekends in Kristen's house now, sleeping in the guest room,
sorting through her sister's belongings one drawer at a time. Sometimes she found things Kristen had never spoken of, old sketchbooks from her early 20s, letters from the father, who had died when they were girls. But there were no journals, no private confessions, no final words. In early December, Claire met with Elise again. The two women walked slowly through the aisles of the general store where Kristen had worked. She'd talk about her paintings sometimes, Elise said, but never in a dramatic way. Just she felt like something in the woods inspired her. Said she never ran out of ideas when she walked back there. Claire nodded. Did she ever mention feeling like someone was watching her? Elise hesitated. Once, she said. Maybe a month before she disappeared. She said she had this dream, where someone was in the trees while she painted. Not chasing her, just there. Still, like they were waiting. Claire took a mental note. Dreams often revealed fears people couldn't articulate in waking life. She laughed about it. Elise added. Said it was silly. But Claire didn't find it silly. Later that week, Claire revisited the box of photographs sent to the post office, the altered versions of Kristen's paintings. She spread them out on the long table in the department's cold case office, and studied them for hours. The changes were subtle, but undeniably intentional. In the painting of the river, a figure now stood on the bank, barely distinguishable from the trees around him. In the painting of the old barn, a shadow fell across the threshold, just where the light should have touched. Whoever altered the images had studied Kristen's work intimately. It wasn't random vandalism, it was mimicry, obsession. Claire decided to pursue a digital angle more aggressively. She contacted a cyber analyst in Montpellier and asked for help analyzing Kristen's online activity in the weeks before her disappearance. Though Kristen had no social media accounts and rarely emailed, she had visited a few artist forums and an online marketplace for selling prints. One username stood out, Wilderness Eye. It had messaged Kristen 4 times in the final week before she vanished. The tone was friendly at first, asking about her artwork and her technique. But the final message took a darker turn. There is something behind your work. You can't hide it forever. You see it too. I know you do. Kristen never responded. The account had been deleted shortly after the date of her disappearance. Claire sent the username and its metadata to the state's cybercrimes unit. It had been routed through a proxy server, bouncing through multiple locations. Whoever owned the account had taken pains to remain invisible. By mid-December, snowfall blanketed the region. The forest trails became harder to traverse. Still, Claire persisted. She met again with Russell Kemp, the man who had claimed to see someone in the woods the night Kristen disappeared. Russell remained difficult. He was deeply private, and had a wary, inward manner, like a man who'd grown too used to his own company. But Claire pressed gently, probing again about that night. "Are you sure it wasn't her?" she asked. "I saw someone," he replied. "Didn't say it was Kristen. Did you see them leave?" "No. What were you doing out there so late?" Russell gave her a long look. "I live there." Claire knew pushing further would yield nothing, but something about his flat tone, the way he'd sketched women in the woods, still haunted her. She filed for a warrant to search his property again. This time, they brought dogs trained to detect electronic devices. Behind the shed, buried under loose stones, they found a second notebook. It was full of observations, dates, times, sketches, even weather conditions, and it referenced Kristen multiple times. White farmhouse, porch light always on. She paints late. She walks the path by the brook at dusk. Alone. Saw her again. She looked at me today. But the entries stopped a week before she disappeared. When confronted, Russell shrugged. "I watch birds. I write things down. So what?" It wasn't enough for charges. Claire left the property angry and frustrated, aware that proximity and creepiness weren't crimes. But in her gut, she believed Russell had seen something, or knew something that he wasn't sharing. As Christmas approached, a man in Brattleboro contacted the sheriff's department. He had been hiking near Green River Reservoir in mid-October, when he found a scarf tangled in the underbrush. He'd thought nothing of it then, but after seeing a news story about Kristen, he remembered. The scarf, he said, was pale blue with tiny white flowers, just like the one Kristen was known to wear. The location was 20 miles from her home. Claire visited the man's cabin, and he showed her where he'd stored it in his garage. It was brittle with cold and smelled faintly of wet leaves. The scarf was sent to the lab for analysis. 2 weeks later, the results came back. It was Kristen's. There were no fingerprints on it, but hers. No DNA from any other source. No blood. Just a scarf, tangled in the woods far from her daily routine, left behind without context. It raised more questions than answers. Why had she gone so far from home? Who would take her out there and leave so little behind? Was she trying to escape something? Or had she been led? As the year ended, Claire met with Maureen one last time before the holidays. They sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse. A fire crackled quietly. Outside, the wind traced long fingers against the window panes. "Do you think she's gone?" Maureen asked. Claire hesitated. "I think someone wanted her gone, but that doesn't mean we stop looking. She was always drawn to things other people didn't see." Maureen said quietly. "The way light fell through trees. The way shadows moved on snow. I think maybe she saw something no one else could. And maybe someone didn't want her to show it." They sat in silence for a long time. That night, Claire stood alone in Kristen's art room. The unfinished painting still leaned on the easel, brushes dry, canvas bare in the corners. She stared at it, searching for anything she might have missed. Then she noticed something. Along the lower edge of the canvas, barely visible under the wash of pale color, was a series of letters, hidden like the others, in pencil. Not a message this time, but a set of initials and a date. RK Mittis 10/5. Claire felt a chill. October 5th, 3 days before Kristen vanished. And the initials, RK Russell Kemp. The initials RK etched into the bottom corner of Kristen's unfinished canvas, hung heavily in Claire's mind as winter deepened around Athens, Vermont. It was a small detail, but it felt significant, like a whisper from a story half told, an unfinished sentence waiting for resolution. The following morning, Claire returned to the farmhouse, now officially a kind of shrine to the missing artist. Maureen was there, sorting through old letters and photographs on the kitchen table. She looked up when Claire entered, her eyes tired but steady. "I found something," Maureen said quietly, holding out a weathered envelope sealed with faded blue tape. It was in one of Kristen's boxes. Claire carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter, written in Kristen's familiar flowing handwriting. October 4th, 2009. Dear Maureen, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I didn't want to worry you. But I've met someone who understands what I'm trying to do with my art. His name is Russell. He's different. He sees the woods like I do. He's been helping me, showing me places where the light is just right. We've been talking about projects, ideas that might take me away from here. I'm scared but excited. I just want you to know I'm okay. Love, Kristen. Claire felt a sudden tightening in her chest. This was the first direct mention of Russell Kemp in Kristen's own words, a detail that complicated the neat lines of suspicion and uncertainty she had drawn around him. Maureen nodded slowly. She never mentioned this to me. Not once. Claire looked back at the letter, rereading the final lines. The tone was hopeful, almost joyous. It seemed Kristen believed she had found a friend, perhaps even a kindred spirit. Yet that hope was fragile. It was followed swiftly by silence. Claire arranged for a renewed search of Russell's property, focusing on his workshop and living areas. There was a methodical precision to his belongings, a strange orderliness that belied the wild, tangled nature of the surrounding forest. Inside, Claire found a series of notebooks, similar to the one buried behind the shed, but more detailed, more personal. In one entry, dated October 3rd, Russell wrote, "She came again today. Quiet as the trees. I showed her the clearing near the creek. She said it felt like coming home. I hope she trusts me. I want to protect her. The next entry, October 5th, was more cryptic. She is scared. I know why now. I see the others watching. They don't like what she draws. She is not safe here. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she read those words. The others was vague, but the tone was urgent, fearful. Who were these others? Were they real people, or shadows cast by Russell's mind? The notebooks revealed no clear answers, only a growing sense of paranoia, or perhaps of protection, someone trying to shield Kristen from unseen dangers. Claire spoke again with Russell, who now appeared more withdrawn, his responses clipped and defensive. She showed him the letter and the notebook entries, watching closely for any reaction. He blinked slowly, then looked away. I didn't want her to get hurt, he said softly. But sometimes, people don't want what they don't understand. Kristen saw things others didn't. What things? Claire asked. He shrugged. Shapes in the woods, voices on the wind, a presence. I thought she was special. Claire understood then that Russell was not simply a witness or an observer. In his mind, he was a guardian, a man convinced he was protecting Kristen from a force he believed to be real, though unseen by others. But how much of that protection crossed into obsession, and had it led to her disappearance? The days that followed brought no further evidence. No clues, no sighting. Kristen remained missing. One afternoon, as Claire was leaving the farmhouse, she noticed something different. Maureen stood on the porch, staring into the distance, her hands clenched tightly around a folded piece of paper. It came today, she said simply, handing the note to Claire. It was postmarked from Montpellier, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message typed in careful, deliberate print. You are looking in the wrong place. The answer is not in the woods, but where the river bends. Look closer. Claire felt a surge of conflicting emotions, hope, frustration, disbelief. Where the river bends was a place she had visited repeatedly, walking the banks of the West River, searching for anything out of place. But the note suggested there was something she had missed. The note was unsigned. No indication of who sent it, or why. Claire shared the message with the forensic team, hoping they might find fingerprints, or other forensic clues. But the paper was clean. Over the next several days, Claire returned to the river bend, pacing the shoreline, eyes searching the brush, the rocks, the fallen branches. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, the river was swollen, the current fast and thick with debris. Claire walked carefully along the bank, boots sinking into the wet earth. Near a cluster of moss-covered stones, something caught her eye. A thin strip of fabric, snagged on a jagged root. It was dark green. She pulled it free, careful not to damage it. It was a piece of clothing, thin, worn, with faint traces of threadbare stitching. The lab confirmed it was from a jacket Kristen had been known to wear the previous autumn. The realization hit Claire hard. Kristen had been at the river bend recently, much more recently than anyone had supposed. The spot was remote, difficult to access without a clear trail, and it raised troubling questions. Had Kristen been trying to meet someone there, or had she been forced to go? The river was both a barrier and a boundary, a place where land and water collided, where secrets could easily be swept away. Claire intensified the search in the area, using sonar equipment to scan beneath the water's surface, sending divers into the chilly depths. No trace of Kristen emerged. Yet the evidence, scarves, fabric, letters kept pointing to movement away from the farmhouse, deeper into the wilderness. Was Kristen trying to escape? Or had someone lured her further into the shadows? In the cold stillness of the investigation, Claire often thought about Kristen's art, the haunting quality that had drawn so many to her work. Each painting was a fragment of a larger story, pieces of a puzzle formed by light and shadow, by what could be seen, and what was hidden. She began to see Kristen's disappearance as not just a crime but a rupture, a fracture in a delicate balance between the natural world and the human heart. And in that fracture, something dangerous had taken root. As December gave way to January, Claire revisited the online forums, where Kristen had briefly connected with others. There she found a new clue, a message thread from a user named Forest Watcher, who claimed to have met Kristen in the days before she vanished. The posts were cryptic and brief. She spoke of a presence that wouldn't leave her alone. I told her to be careful. Some things in these woods don't like to be disturbed. She said she had to finish her work, no matter the cost. Claire tracked down the IP address, leading to a small cabin on the edge of the forest several miles from Russell's property. The owner was a man in his late 60s, named Harold Jennings, a retired park ranger, known for his knowledge of the local wilderness. Harold was cautious at first, but as Claire spoke softly and patiently about Kristen, he revealed a few details. Yes, I met her. She was quiet, focused. She asked about old trails and hidden clearings. Said she wanted to capture the spirit of the woods before it was gone. Did she ever mention feeling afraid? Claire asked. Harold nodded. She talked about shadows and sounds. Said sometimes it felt like the trees were watching her. And you, did you believe that? He smiled sadly. The woods hold their own stories. Sometimes, people see what they need to see. Sometimes, what they fear. Claire left the cabin with a sense of unresolved mystery, the boundaries between reality and perception blurring further. The case was no longer just about finding a missing woman. It was about understanding the fragile, sometimes dangerous intersection between human creativity and the natural world, a place where the unseen could feel all too real. In the quiet moments, Claire found herself returning to Kristen's paintings, searching again for clues in brushstrokes and shadows. She wondered if the answers were hidden there, in the whispers of color and light, or if some truths would remain forever out of reach. The woods around Athens had claimed their secret, and in the cold depths of winter, the mystery endured. As the bitter cold of January deepened, the landscape of Athens, Vermont, lay under a heavy blanket of snow, softening the edges of the forest, and muffling the sounds of the world. The woods seemed to hold their breath, as if guarding their secret even more fiercely beneath this quiet white. Detective Claire Donovan found herself drawn back once again to the farmhouse, to Maureen, and to the memories of Kristen's life and disappearance that still echoed there. It had been months now since Kristen vanished without a trace, and the trail had grown cold, cold as the frozen earth underfoot. Yet for Claire, the case was far from closed. She sat with Maureen by the small kitchen table, the afternoon light filtering dimly through the curtains. Maureen was knitting, her hands moving slowly and methodically, a habit that seemed to anchor her when her mind threatened to drift into painful uncertainty. I keep thinking, Maureen said quietly, about the last time I saw her. The way she looked at that painting, the one she never finished. Like she was trying to tell me something without words. Claire nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind the words. Kristen's final painting was indeed a mystery in itself. The image was haunting, an abstract swirl of dark greens and grays, with faint hints of a figure slipping into shadow. The brushstrokes were hurried and uneven, almost as if she had been interrupted. Claire often wondered if that painting held the key to what had happened, if it was a visual diary of the fear and hope Kristen had carried in those final days. But art, by its nature, was open to interpretation. In the weeks following the discovery of the note and the piece of fabric, near the river bend, Claire and her team expanded their search beyond the immediate forest, reaching out to neighboring towns, interviewing hikers, campers, and even seasonal hunters. Many remembered Kristen as quiet, introspective, often seen wandering alone with a sketchbook or camera. But no one had seen her after early October. Russell Kemp remained a figure of interest, though the investigation revealed little direct evidence tying him to Kristen's disappearance. His journals and letters painted a complex portrait of a man deeply attached to the wilderness, and to Kristen, but also tangled in his own fears and perceptions. Claire sometimes wondered if Russell himself was trapped in a world where the line between reality and imagination blurred, a man both protector and prisoner of the wood's unseen forces. There were also the cryptic warnings found in Russell's notebooks about others who did not want Kristen's work to continue. No one could say who those others might be, a rival artist, local townspeople, or something more intangible. Claire kept returning to that question, who if anyone truly wanted Kristen gone? Harold Jennings, the retired park ranger, had been more helpful than most, offering insights into the natural rhythms of the forest, and recounting tales of the wood's eerie stillness and sudden changes. His stories, though grounded in reality, often bordered on the poetic, reminding Claire that this landscape was ancient and wild, holding memories far beyond any human. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire walked the edge of the forest, alone. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots, and the cold air filled her lungs. She paused near the river bend, the spot where the piece of fabric had been found. The water was dark and flowing fast beneath a thin layer of ice, a stark contrast to the calm surface she had seen in the summer months. Claire thought about Kristen standing here, looking out at the river, perhaps feeling the weight of the world in the cold wind. Was this where Kristen had last been? Had she planned to leave? Had she hoped someone would find her? The questions came without answers.
Back in her office, Claire pored over the case files one more time, reviewing witness statements, photographs, and all the evidence gathered. She noticed something subtle, a pattern in Kristen's communications, a series of brief notes and sketches sent to friends that hinted at a growing sense of urgency and fear. In one message, Kristen had written about the voices at night and something watching through the trees. She never elaborated. The woods around Athens were known for their beauty, but also for a kind of loneliness that could swallow a person whole. In the weeks that followed, Claire received an anonymous tip directing her to an old logging trail several miles from the farmhouse, a route rarely traveled and largely forgotten. Accompanied by two colleagues, Claire set out to explore it, the snow crunching underfoot and the cold air biting at their faces. The trail wound through thick pines and birch, narrow and overgrown in places. As they walked, Claire noticed the faint remnants of footprints in the snow, some recent, some older. After nearly an hour, the group arrived at a small clearing beside a frozen pond, surrounded by ancient trees. Claire's heart quickened. Among the scattered branches and moss, they found a small collection of items, an old sketchbook, broken pencils, and a worn scarf. The scarf was familiar. It matched the fabric found near the river bend. The sketchbook was weathered but intact. Its pages held delicate drawings of trees, shadows, and strange, almost ethereal figures entwined with the forest. Claire flipped through it slowly, sensing the fragile mind behind the lines. On the final page, written in shaky handwriting, was a message: "I am not afraid anymore. The woods are part of me now. If you find this, remember me as I was trying to find light in the darkness." The discovery sent a ripple through the investigation. The items confirmed that Kristen had ventured far beyond what was originally believed, and that she had left behind a silent testament to her experience. But the note also carried a sense of finality, a farewell perhaps, or a statement of acceptance. Claire sat with the group in the clearing, letting the silence settle around them. The woods had kept their secret, but in these fragments, there was also a story of resilience, of a young woman seeking her truth amid fear and uncertainty. In the months after the discovery, the case was reclassified as a missing person investigation with unresolved questions, the mystery deepening but also settling into a somber peace. Maureen continued to live in the farmhouse, caring for the place Kristen had loved, while creating her own art inspired by her daughter's memory. Claire often thought of Kristen's paintings, unfinished, elusive but full of emotion. They were a reminder that some stories don't end with neat resolutions, but with echoes that linger in the quiet spaces of memory. On a cold spring morning, as the snow began to melt and the forest stirred awake, Claire visited the river bend one last time. She stood silently, watching the water flow, steady, persistent and unknowable, and she whispered a quiet hope that wherever Kristen was, she had found the light she sought in the darkness. The town of Marion, Ohio, nestled quietly in the heartland of America, held a charm that was at once familiar and unassuming. Its tree-lined streets, old brick buildings, and the soft hum of everyday life painted a picture of peaceful simplicity. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, a shadow was slowly beginning to form, one that would unsettle a community and ripple through the lives of many. It was the autumn of 1997 when the story began to unfold, like a quiet thread pulling tight, revealing something far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. Melissa "Missy" King was known to everyone in Marion. At 26 years old, she had a presence that was both radiant and gentle. Her laughter was easy, and her kindness seemed to ripple naturally to those around her. She worked as a receptionist at the local library, a place she loved deeply, a sanctuary filled with stories and quiet moments. Her life was by many accounts ordinary, but those who truly knew her would say there was a spark behind her eyes, a searching for something more. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Melissa had grown increasingly withdrawn. Friends noticed her skipping their usual gatherings, and phone calls often went unanswered. When she did respond, her voice held a fragile edge, like a secret she was carrying alone. Her boyfriend, Tom Ellis, a soft-spoken carpenter with calloused hands and a gentle demeanor, tried to reach out. He sensed a distance between them that he could not bridge, though he never suspected the depths of what lay beneath. On the evening of October 9th, Melissa left work later than usual. The library was quiet, the autumn twilight folding in like a soft blanket. She told Tom she would be home soon, but the walk to her apartment that night would be the last time anyone saw her. When Melissa failed to return, the worry grew quickly. Tom called her friends, searched her favorite spots, and eventually reported her missing to the Marion Police Department. The news spread through the town quietly, but steadily, a missing woman in a place where such things rarely happened. Detective Henry Caldwell was assigned to the case. A man in his early 40s with a calm, methodical approach, Henry had earned the respect of his peers for his ability to listen carefully and follow the subtle threads that others often missed. From the beginning, Henry sensed that Melissa's disappearance was not random. The clues were sparse but telling. Her purse was found near the side entrance of her apartment building, a small smear of blood on the strap. Her keys and phone were missing, as if taken intentionally. The community held its breath as days turned into weeks, and the investigation unfolded slowly. Henry and his team worked tirelessly, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who had seen Melissa in her final days. They pieced together a timeline filled with small moments, an argument overheard, a shadowy figure seen near the library parking lot, cryptic notes found in Melissa's apartment, but nothing concrete. Melissa's family arrived in Marion, bringing with them a flood of memories and pain. Her mother, Grace King, was a woman of quiet strength, her grief tempered by a resolute determination to find her daughter. Grace often sat by the window of her temporary room, clutching a faded photograph of Melissa, a snapshot of her smiling on a summer day. "It doesn't feel real," Grace would whisper to Henry during one of their meetings. "Like she's just gone somewhere, waiting to come back." Henry wished he could offer such hope. One of the more perplexing aspects of the case was Melissa's recent behavior. A close friend, Sarah, confided in Henry that Melissa had been seeing someone new, a man she met at a local art class named Daniel, but no one seemed to know much about him. Sarah described Daniel as charming but secretive, someone who kept his past carefully hidden. With this new lead, Henry turned his attention to Daniel, tracking down every detail he could find. Daniel Roberts was in his early 30s, with a history that included several moves and jobs that seemed to come and go without explanation. A loner by many accounts, he had arrived in Marion only months before meeting Melissa. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, rarely socializing beyond casual greetings. As Henry dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Daniel's story about where he worked didn't match records, and his alibi for the night Melissa disappeared was vague at best. Though there was no direct evidence linking him to Melissa's disappearance, a shadow of suspicion began to grow. One afternoon, Henry received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed to have seen Melissa arguing with Daniel near the river that ran along the edge of town. The voice was shaky, fearful even, but the details felt real. Henry and a small team went to investigate the area, walking the muddy banks and scanning the dense brush. They found nothing but scattered leaves and broken branches, no sign of struggle or evidence. The river, calm and steady under the afternoon sun, seemed indifferent to the turmoil it had witnessed. Back in town, the media caught wind of the investigation, and the pressure mounted. Headlines questioned the safety of Marion, speculated about Melissa's fate, and offered theories ranging from the hopeful to the dark. Yet for Henry and those closest to Melissa, the truth remained elusive. As days slipped into weeks, the investigation unfolded like a slowly turning page, revealing glimpses of a woman caught between hope and fear, love and uncertainty. Her story was marked by small details: a lost earring, a note found under her pillow, a forgotten letter never sent. Henry often wondered if Melissa's disappearance was the beginning of a deeper, darker story, a story not yet fully told. In the quiet moments of the night, he would find himself tracing the edges of her life, trying to understand the shadows that had closed in. The town of Marion, with its peaceful streets and whispering trees, waited too. The days after Melissa's disappearance settled into a slow, aching rhythm. Marion, Ohio, a town usually punctuated by the simple rhythms of daily life, had been silenced by an undercurrent of worry. The once familiar streets now felt charged, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they feared might never come. Detective Henry Caldwell spent long hours sifting through pieces of Melissa's life, piecing together the moments before she vanished. His office became cluttered with photographs, notes and maps, the walls slowly filling with a portrait that was still incomplete. One of the threads Henry pursued was Daniel Roberts, the enigmatic man Melissa had met just months before. Henry had learned that Daniel's history was riddled with gaps and inconsistencies. No records existed of him before he appeared in Marion, and even in town, his presence was ghost-like. The few who had seen him spoke cautiously. He worked odd jobs, a handyman here, a painter there, but no one seemed to know exactly where he came from, or where he went. His charm was described as quiet, but behind it was a wall, a protective distance that few had managed to breach. Henry arranged to meet Daniel at a small cafe near the town square, a neutral place where people came and went, unnoticed by most. When Daniel arrived, he was calm but reserved, his eyes constantly scanning the room, as if wary of what might be lurking in the shadows. "I just want to help," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. "I liked Melissa, she was different." Henry studied him carefully. There was no overt aggression, but a subtle tension, a guardedness that told a deeper story. "What can you tell me about the night she disappeared?" Henry asked gently. Daniel hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "We had a fight. I admit it, I wanted her to move with me, away from here, but she wasn't ready, she needed space. That was the last time I saw her." The confession hung between them, raw and fragile. Henry pressed for more, but Daniel offered little else, no alibi, no clear explanation for his whereabouts after the argument. Outside, the cold wind tugged at the cafe's windows, a reminder that the autumn was slipping toward winter. Henry left with more questions than answers. Back at the station, Henry turned his attention to the scattered notes and letters found in Melissa's apartment. Among them was a small journal, its pages filled with messy handwriting and sketches, an intimate glimpse into her mind. The journal revealed a woman caught in conflict, torn between her longing for freedom and the pull of relationships she wasn't ready to leave behind. One entry stood out. "Sometimes the world feels too small, like the walls are closing in. I see things differently, and I wonder if anyone else notices. There's a darkness just beneath the surface, waiting." Henry read the words again and again, feeling the weight of the emotions behind them. It was as if Melissa had sensed something lurking, something unseen. He shared the journal with Grace King, Melissa's mother, during a quiet meeting. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she traced the words with her fingers. "She was so much more than we knew," Grace whispered. "I wish I could have been there for her."
The emotional toll on the family was deepening. Grace, her husband Robert, and Melissa's younger sister Emily took turns visiting the police station, offering memories, photographs, anything that might help. Emily, a bright and gentle 18-year-old, often brought along Melissa's favorite music, soft melodies that floated through the sterile halls, a reminder of the sister she missed. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded. Henry's team checked local surveillance footage, searched for witnesses, and reviewed phone records. A pattern began to emerge, several calls made from Melissa's phone shortly before it went silent, all to a number registered under a different name. The number traced back to a man named Stephen Walters, a local with a reputation as a drifter and occasional troublemaker. Stephen was known around town, but had managed to stay under the radar for most serious incidents. When Henry and his colleagues found him at a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Marion, he was reluctant to talk, but the detective's calm persistence eventually cracked through the walls of suspicion. Stephen admitted to knowing Melissa, though their relationship was casual at best. He claimed that on the night she disappeared, she had come to him in distress, frightened and seeking help. She was scared of someone. Stephen said quietly. I told her to call the police, but she wouldn't. Said she couldn't trust anyone. Stephen's confession added a new layer of complexity. Who was Melissa afraid of? And why? Henry's thoughts circled back to Daniel, to the shadows in Melissa's journal, to the secret fears she had carried. Days turned into weeks, and the chill of early winter crept across Marion. The town's trees stood bare, their skeletal branches etched starkly against grey skies. In the midst of this, Henry received a call that would shift the investigation in an unexpected direction. A local man named Harold Benson, a hunter and longtime resident, reported finding something unusual while walking his dog near an abandoned railway track just outside town. Henry and his team drove out immediately, boots crunching on frosted grass and gravel. They arrived at a small clearing, where Harold pointed to a disturbed patch of earth beneath a tangle of briars. Carefully, the officers began to dig. What they uncovered was a worn leather purse, Melissa's. Inside were a few personal items, an old locket, a folded photograph of her family, and a small notebook with scribbled phone numbers. But more importantly, there were traces of dried blood. The discovery sent a wave through the investigation. Here was proof that Melissa had been at this remote location in the days following her disappearance. Henry examined the scene carefully, noting footprints leading into the forest, some fresh, some older. The area was rough and overgrown, a place few locals ventured, which suggested that Melissa might have been hiding or forced to seek refuge there. The question remained, who had been with her? And what had happened? That night, Henry sat alone in his office, the quiet interrupted only by the distant sounds of the town settling for the night. He pondered the fragments of Melissa's life, the unanswered questions, and the growing sense that beneath the calm of Marion, a hidden story waited to be told. The case had become more than a missing person investigation. It was a glimpse into the fragility of human connection, the secrets we keep, and the shadows we sometimes cannot escape. As the cold settled in, Henry resolved to keep searching, to listen for the faintest whisper of truth, no matter how deeply buried. Melissa's story was still unfolding. The discovery of Melissa's purse near the abandoned railway track deepened the mystery, yet it also gave Detective Henry Caldwell a fragile thread to hold on to. The evidence was tangible now, a sign that Melissa had indeed been somewhere beyond the safety of her apartment, after the night she vanished. But it also raised new questions, questions that felt heavier with each passing day. The days following the discovery were marked by renewed urgency. Henry and his team expanded their search around the site, combing through underbrush and dense trees, looking for any sign that might lead them to Melissa, or to the truth of what had happened. The forest was quiet, holding its secrets beneath the fallen leaves and twisting branches. It was easy to imagine how someone could slip away unnoticed, how a person might feel lost, vulnerable, isolated amid the vastness. Local volunteers joined the search parties, their faces etched with concern and fatigue, carrying flashlights and calling out names in the chilly air. It was a town united in grief and hope, each person wishing for a miracle, but the answers remained elusive. Amid the growing tension, Henry focused on the details inside Melissa's purse. Among the personal items was a small notebook, its pages filled with names and numbers, some crossed out, others circled. It seemed like a record of contact, a map of the connections in her life. One entry caught Henry's attention, a name Ruth, followed by a phone number. Henry tracked down the number, and soon found himself sitting across from Ruth Anderson, a woman in her early 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Ruth had known Melissa for years, their friendship rooted in community events and shared stories. When Henry mentioned the disappearance, Ruth's face clouded with sorrow. Melissa was always searching for something, she said softly. She had dreams bigger than this town, but she was afraid of what might happen if she left. Ruth explained that Melissa had confided in her about a man she feared, someone who had been watching her, making her uneasy. She never gave a name, but the fear in her voice had been real. The conversation deepened Henry's conviction that Melissa's disappearance was tied to a person, someone close enough to cause fear, but far enough away from easy suspicion. Back at the station, Henry reviewed the phone records again, comparing them with the notebook's entries. One number stood out, called repeatedly in the days leading up to Melissa's disappearance. It belonged to a man named Carl Jennings, a local who had a history of volatile relationships. Carl was known in Marion for his fiery temper and brushes with the law, mostly minor assaults and disturbances, but nothing violent enough to raise immediate alarms. Henry arranged to meet Carl at his modest home on the outskirts of town. When Henry arrived, Carl greeted him with a wary look, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "I hear you've been asking questions about Melissa," Carl said without preamble. Henry nodded calmly. "I'm just trying to understand what happened. Can you tell me about your relationship with her?" Carl's expression shifted, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the tough exterior. "We dated briefly," he admitted. "It didn't end well. I wanted to protect her, but maybe I was too much. She wanted to be free, and I couldn't give her that." Henry asked about the days before Melissa disappeared. "We argued," Carl said quietly. "I was angry, but I didn't hurt her. I swear it." Despite Carl's protestations, Henry noted a pattern, a series of calls from Melissa to Carl, often late at night, and several messages left unanswered. It was clear that Melissa's relationships were tangled with pain and fear, a web of emotional strain. That evening, Henry sat down with the fragments of the investigation, notes from Ruth, the journal entries, interviews with Daniel and Carl, and felt the weight of complexity pressing in. Melissa had been surrounded by people, yet felt alone. The next morning, Henry received a call from one of the search teams. They had found a piece of cloth caught on a branch several hundred yards from the railway track. It was a fragment of fabric, faded and torn, that matched the jacket Melissa was last seen wearing. Near the cloth was a faint footprint, partially obscured by mud. The discovery added a new layer of urgency. Henry requested forensic analysis immediately, hoping to find traces of DNA or other evidence. As the lab worked through the night, Henry reached out to the community, encouraging anyone with information to come forward. The fear and suspicion in Marion began to grow, neighbors eyeing one another with unease, whispered rumors threading through quiet conversations. One afternoon, a local teenager named Michael came forward. Michael was quiet, unassuming, and had noticed something the night Melissa disappeared. He told Henry he had seen a dark-colored truck parked near the railway track around the time Melissa was believed to be there. The truck was big, maybe a pickup, Michael said. It stayed for a while, then drove off fast when I came close. Henry took note, asking about the truck's license plate, but Michael couldn't remember. It was just a fleeting image in his mind, a shadow among shadows. The investigation moved forward with cautious steps. Henry followed leads on local truck owners, cross-referencing those with histories of violence or suspicion. Days later, the forensic report returned. The cloth contained traces of blood, matching Melissa's DNA. More startlingly, there was a second set of DNA, unidentified. This discovery widened the scope. The second DNA hinted at a struggle, possibly with an unknown person. Henry felt the weight of this truth. Melissa's disappearance was no longer just a mystery, it was a crime. He coordinated with state authorities, widening the search radius, and running the unknown DNA through national databases. Meanwhile, in the quiet town of Marion, families kept close, doors locked a little tighter, and the sense of safety fractured. Henry's investigations led him back to Daniel Roberts. Under renewed questioning, Daniel's story shifted. He admitted to meeting Melissa near the river that night, but denied any involvement in harm. "I wanted to talk, to convince her to come with me," Daniel said, eyes fixed on the floor. "I left when she walked away. I swear I didn't follow her." The detective sensed a complexity in Daniel's words, a mixture of regret, desperation, and something unspoken. As Henry pressed for details, Daniel revealed he had noticed a man watching Melissa from a distance, someone he didn't recognize, but who seemed to follow her on occasion. The pieces of the puzzle remained scattered, elusive. Meanwhile, Melissa's family struggled with the unknown. Grace King held on to hope, but feared the worst. She clung to memories of her daughter's laughter, the warmth of her embrace, and the gentle moments before the silence. Emily, Melissa's sister, had taken to writing letters to Melissa, placing them under the window where the last light of the evening touched the floor. "Please come home," one letter read simply. The town's quiet was punctuated by candlelight vigils, gatherings where neighbors shared stories and prayers, hoping to bring Melissa back. In these moments, the community's bond grew stronger, but so did the shadow of fear. As winter deepened, Henry knew the investigation was at a crossroads. The unknown DNA held a key, but the trail was growing cold. Then a breakthrough came in the form of a call from the National Lab. An identification had been made. The unknown DNA matched a man named Jason Miller, a drifter with a record of violent offenses, recently seen passing through Marion. Jason had vanished without a trace. The news sent ripples through the town and the investigation. Henry immediately issued an alert, coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions. The search for Jason Miller became urgent. The story that began with a missing woman was now a pursuit of a dangerous man who might hold the answers to the silence that enveloped Melissa's fate. Henry felt the weight of responsibility keenly, knowing that every step forward might bring clarity or heartbreak. In the quiet moments between the search and the waiting, the detective reflected on Melissa's life, a young woman caught in a web of fear, love, and desperation. Her story was far from over. The news of Jason Miller's DNA match cast a new sharp light over the long months of searching and waiting. Detective Henry Caldwell understood the gravity of this revelation. It meant they were no longer chasing a shadow, but a person who might hold the truth about Melissa King's disappearance. Yet the truth was still veiled, tangled within the darkness of uncertainty and fear. Jason Miller was a drifter by nature, a man with no fixed address, known to drift from town to town across the Midwest. His past was marked by violent episodes, and a troubling pattern of evading law enforcement. There was little about him that inspired confidence or hope for closure. In the months before Melissa vanished, Jason had been seen in various small towns, slipping like a ghost through unfamiliar streets. But to Henry, Jason was now the most tangible lead they had. Henry coordinated with federal agencies, law enforcement across several states, and a network of informants in the underbelly of transient communities. The task was daunting. Tracking a man like Jason required patience and meticulous piecing together of scant evidence. Gas station sightings, fleeting social media footprints, tips from people who saw but did not speak. The community of Marion, meanwhile, braced itself. The fragile hope that Melissa might be found alive was tempered by the harsh reality of Jason's history. Rumors circulated quietly in whispers. Did he take her? Was she still alive? Or had the cold woods finally swallowed her whole? For Melissa's family, the news was a cruel mixture of relief and torment. At least now, they had a name, a face, someone to hold accountable. But every new piece of evidence also deepened the wound. reminding them of the unknowns that refused to fade. Grace King sat quietly in her living room one afternoon, a letter from Melissa's school tucked inside a stack of papers on the table. It was a letter Melissa had written months before her disappearance, filled with dreams about traveling, making a difference, and someday returning to Marion with stories of a world beyond the town's borders. Grace held the letter close, tracing the familiar handwriting with trembling fingers. The daughter she loved so fiercely was gone, and yet here in this fragile paper was a glimpse of her vibrant spirit. Detective Henry found himself returning to the places Melissa loved, the river where she liked to sit and watch the water flow, the small cafe where she often spent afternoons, the quiet park benches under the maple trees. Each spot held memories, fragments of a life interrupted. The search for Jason Miller eventually led Henry to a rundown trailer park outside a larger city miles away. A tip from an informant suggested Jason might be hiding there, but when police arrived, the trailer was empty, abandoned and silent. Despite this, the discovery felt significant. Jason's trail was narrowing. As Henry reviewed the timeline, he noted one chilling detail. Phone records indicated that Melissa's phone had pinged near that city's outskirts several days after her disappearance. This was both hopeful and frightening. It suggested Melissa was alive after all, at least for a time, but it also meant she was in a place far from Marion, perhaps trapped or hidden. Over the next few weeks, investigators worked tirelessly, canvassing neighborhoods, reviewing surveillance footage, and questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something. The investigation was exhaustive, and yet the truth remained elusive. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on Melissa's family deepened. Grace found herself oscillating between hope and despair, often retreating into silence or bursts of quiet tears. Emily, Melissa's sister, channeled her anguish into activism, starting a local group to support families of missing persons. Their grief was layered with resilience, a testament to their love and to the community that stood with them. Back in Marion, the nights grew colder, and the trees outside whispered with the wind. The town's rhythm slowed, punctuated by the weight of absence and unanswered questions. Detective Henry knew that the case would define much of his career, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the humanity woven through every detail. The mother's heartbreak, the sister's fight, the town's collective breath held in quiet anticipation. One evening, Henry sat alone in his office, staring at a map pinned with notes and photos. Among them was a photo of Melissa, her bright eyes, her hopeful smile, frozen in a moment before everything changed. He thought about Jason Miller, where he was now, what he was doing, and what role he had played in the silence surrounding Melissa. Then came a phone call from a small-town sheriff's department. They had apprehended a man matching Jason's description during a routine check. He had been living under an alias, trying to stay hidden. The news spread quietly but swiftly through the investigation team. Jason Miller was now in custody. Henry traveled to the detention center to interview Jason, hoping that the man might finally shed light on the mystery that had haunted so many lives. Jason was a shadow of the person Henry had imagined. Tired eyes, unshaven face, hands that trembled slightly. Yet beneath that weariness was a fierce defiance. In the dim room, Henry asked gently about Melissa King. Jason's eyes flickered, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. "I knew her," he admitted after a long pause. "But I didn't want this. I didn't mean for it to happen." The confession was cryptic, but it was a start. Jason spoke of a night when an argument escalated, of things said in anger and fear. He described how Melissa tried to run, how he lost control in a moment that unraveled everything. Yet despite his words, the full truth remained just out of reach, details obscured by time, by memory, by the human instinct to protect oneself. Jason led the investigators to a remote area, where he said Melissa had fallen and been injured. He claimed to have left her there, intending to return but never having the chance. Henry and his team searched the site thoroughly, uncovering traces of clothing and personal items that matched Melissa's. The evidence corroborated parts of Jason's story, but the absence of a body left an unbearable silence. For Melissa's family, this partial truth was a double-edged sword, relief mixed with an ache that no confirmation could fully heal. The months that followed were marked by painstaking legal proceedings, interviews, and testimonies. Jason Miller faced charges, but the case was complicated by the lack of a body and concrete proof beyond his words. Yet, even amid uncertainty, the community of Marion came together in small, quiet ways, lighting candles on cold nights, sharing memories in hushed voices, holding on to the hope that Melissa's story would one day find peace. Detective Henry, as the case reached its tentative conclusion, reflected on the human cost of the investigation, the lives altered, the trust broken and rebuilt, the resilience of those who refused to let silence be the final word. Melissa King's disappearance was not just a case file, it was a story of a young woman's dreams and fears, a family's enduring love, and a town's collective heartbeat holding on to hope. In the end, the mystery remained partially unresolved, a reminder that some stories do not end neatly, but live on in memory and longing.
The town of Belridge, North Carolina, was small, humid, and largely forgotten. It rested quietly between pine forests and tobacco fields, its roads lined with century-old oaks and red clay that stained the bottoms of every shoe that passed through. In the late summer of 2004, the heat clung thick to the air, and the cicadas sang loud enough to drown out conversation. Nothing much happened in Belridge. People liked it that way. So when 31-year-old Mark Riley didn't show up for his shift at the lumber mill on a Monday morning, it was less an emergency than an inconvenience. Mark was dependable to a fault, never late, rarely sick, but it was possible folks reasoned that he'd simply taken a weekend trip and forgotten to tell someone. He lived alone on the outskirts of town in a single-story house off Linton Road. It was the kind of place that only looked like home if you'd grown up with quiet. By Tuesday morning, the mill manager called the sheriff, not because there was any confirmed danger, but because this was Belridge, and Mark just didn't disappear. Deputy Carla Boone was the one to drive out to Mark's property that afternoon. She knew him vaguely, everyone did. He'd been raised in Belridge, worked steady jobs since high school, lived simply. He was polite in the way quiet men often are, and a little isolated, though never unfriendly. No criminal history, no trouble with anyone. His house sat behind a rusted gate, shaded by tall trees that let in only a sliver of sunlight. The grass was overgrown, not alarmingly so, but enough to suggest no one had been tending it for a few days. When Carla knocked, there was no answer. She walked the perimeter slowly, calling his name. No sign of struggle, no broken windows, just silence. His truck was parked in the dirt driveway, keys still inside. The front door was locked, but through the window, Carla could see the flicker of a lamp, still on though dimmed by the hour. That was odd. She called for backup. When they entered, they found the house meticulously neat. No sign of forced entry. A pair of work boots by the door, folded laundry on the couch, 2 coffee mugs in the sink. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, powered off. The refrigerator was stocked, the bed made, the only thing missing was Mark. A day later, the case was elevated to a missing person investigation. Posters were printed. Interviews began. Most people said the same thing. Mark was private but kind, a man of routine, not the sort to just up and leave. A few neighbors reported seeing someone visiting his house in the days before he vanished, a woman they thought, with dark hair and a northern accent. No one knew her name. The sheriff's office pulled phone records. Mark had received several calls from a number registered in New York. Each conversation lasted several minutes. One came in late Friday night, around 11 p.m., and had lasted nearly half an hour. A week passed. Then 2. The forest surrounding Belridge was searched by volunteers and dogs, mile after mile of pine and underbrush combed for any sign of Mark or foul play. Nothing. The only thing they found was a black leather wallet belonging to him, discovered by a creek 2 miles from his house. It was dry and intact. His ID and debit card was still inside, but the cash was gone. As the town grew quieter with unease, Carla kept digging. She requested financial records, searched social media, and began reconstructing the final days of Mark Riley's life. And that's when she discovered something no one expected. 2 years earlier, Mark had received a large wire transfer from a private account, nearly $35,000. The sender's name was Diana Trask. There was no mention of Diana in his public records, no shared property, no marriage, no lawsuits. She wasn't local. No one in Belridge recognized her name. Carla tracked Diana to Brooklyn, New York. A former journalist, now working as a freelance researcher, she'd lived in the city for over a decade. When contacted, she was calm but distant. "I knew Mark," she said plainly. "We were friends. From a long time ago." "How long ago?" Carla asked. 15 years. "We met in Arizona. I was working on a story. He was going by another name then." That caught Carla off guard. "He changed his name." "Yes. He had good reason to. He was trying to disappear." When Carla pressed for more, Diana hesitated. She admitted to visiting him a few days before his disappearance. She had stayed in town for 3 days. They talked, caught up, but she claimed she left Sunday morning and hadn't heard from him since. Carla asked why Mark had changed his name. Diana refused to say. Back in Belridge, whispers began to circulate. Who had Mark Riley really been? Why had he been hiding? Carla returned to his home with a warrant. She went through old letters, dusty storage boxes, and the contents of an aging desktop computer. Most of it seemed unremarkable. Utility bills, grocery receipts, an old love letter dated 1992, but buried in a folder in his desk drawer, she found a passport in a different name. Aaron Bledsoe. The photo was unmistakably Mark's. Same eyes, same shy smile. Aaron Bledsoe had been suspected of involvement in a violent robbery in Phoenix in 1993. No one had been killed, but 3 people were badly injured. 2 men were arrested. One, Aaron, was never found. That changed everything. Mark Riley, the man Belridge knew and trusted, had been living under an assumed identity for over a decade. He had built a life of quiet, had kept his head down, and somehow managed to bury a past most people couldn't imagine. But who had discovered it? And who had reason to make him disappear? Carla flew to Arizona and met with the original case detective, now long retired but still lucid. He remembered Aaron, smart, quiet, like he knew he didn't belong in that life. Got in deep with the wrong people, but I never believed he planned the robbery. Carla asked if Aaron had enemies. The detective just shrugged. If he ran, it was because he thought someone would kill him. That kind of fear doesn't go away. As Carla pieced together the old and new, a timeline emerged. Mark had reinvented himself, stayed under the radar, and built a life of penance and peace. But something, perhaps a visit from someone who hadn't forgotten, had pulled him back into the past. She looked again at Diana Trask. Was she protecting him, or hiding something? In a recorded second interview, Diana revealed a chilling detail. Mark told me someone from the past had found him. Someone dangerous.
He was afraid. Did he say who?
No, but he said he didn't think he'd be around much longer. Carla felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. Mark hadn't simply disappeared. He had been hunted, and the person who had found him was likely still out there. Though most residents had known him for over a decade, the revelation that the quiet, reliable man who kept to himself had a hidden past changed how people looked at everything he left behind. Whispers spread through grocery store aisles, murmurs across church pews. But despite the unease, no one had anything concrete. Just a growing void, where trust used to live. Sheriff Ray Canning, a measured man in his 60s with decades of small-town law enforcement experience, had always believed that the world beyond Belridge moved at a different pace. But now it seemed to be crashing into their quiet corner of North Carolina. And the person who brought that collision, Mark or Aaron, depending on how you saw it, was nowhere to be found. Deputy Carla Boone took the lead on the case with quiet determination. She was in her late 30s, pragmatic, a single mother of 2 who had returned to Belridge after a failed marriage in Atlanta. Her mind was sharp, but more importantly, she knew how to listen. She understood the value of silence, especially in a town where people often said more with what they didn't say. She started over. reconstructed the days leading up to Mark's disappearance with meticulous care. He had last been seen publicly on Saturday morning at the Belridge Feed and Supply, buying dog food. The cashier remembered he'd seemed distracted, even anxious. He'd barely made small talk, which was unusual. Later that afternoon, a neighbor recalled seeing a dark-colored sedan parked in front of Mark's house. The plates were out of state, possibly New York, possibly not. The car was gone by the time the sun set. The visitor, they presumed, was Diana Trask. Carla placed her under soft surveillance. Not because Diana was a confirmed suspect, but because her proximity to Mark's disappearance, and her own evasiveness, left too many unanswered questions. Back in Brooklyn, Diana lived in a modest second-floor apartment filled with books, half-written manuscripts, and the scent of strong coffee. She answered the door when a plainclothes officer knocked, cooperative but tired. "I told you everything," she said. "I came down to see him because I was worried. He'd told me someone had found him. I didn't know what to believe, so I wanted to see for myself." "Why send him money?" the officer asked. "He called me in 2002. Said he wanted to start over. I'd just come into a small inheritance. I wired him the money to get him on his feet. I owed him that much." "What did you owe him for?" She paused. "He saved my life once." The officer waited, but she didn't elaborate. Back in Belridge, Carla dug deeper into Aaron Bledsoe's past, now no longer a historical footnote, but the key to everything. She got access to old case files from Phoenix, flew down once again, and sat across from one of the men originally arrested for the robbery in 1993, Anthony Vega, now serving a 35-year sentence at Lewis State Prison. Anthony was graying, his body softened with age, but his eyes still held a flicker of defiance. When Carla showed him a photo of Mark Riley, he leaned forward, squinted, then leaned back. "Yeah, that's Bledsoe. What do you remember about him?" Anthony chuckled. "Quiet kid. Didn't belong. He was supposed to be the lookout, but he flaked. Didn't show up when it counted." "You mean he abandoned the job?" "I mean he ran. Got scared. Left us hanging." Carla asked if anyone had reason to come after him. Anthony shrugged. "After 20 years? Doubt it. Unless someone still thinks he's holding out on a piece of the money." Carla frowned. "There was missing money." He nodded. "About 20 grand. Police never found it. Some people always thought Bledsoe took it. I didn't. Kid didn't have it in him. He ran 'cause he was scared, not greedy. But even fear can leave loose ends." Back in Belridge, Carla began to consider a grim possibility. Someone from that old crew, or someone who believed Mark still had the missing money, had tracked him down. Diana was re-interviewed under more formal conditions. She sat at a table, in a conference room in Brooklyn's 88th precinct, hands folded neatly. "Mark told me someone had reached out to him," she said. "A man calling himself Levi." "Did he give a last name?" "No. Just that the man knew his real name, knew what happened in Phoenix." "Do you know who Levi is?" "No. But Mark said he sounded patient, like he'd been waiting a long time." Carla had no known record of a Levi connected to the robbery. No one from the original case matched. But the name stuck with her. She ran searches, social media cross-references, and eventually landed on a man named Levi Calderon, originally from Phoenix. Criminal record that included fraud, robbery and weapons charges, though he'd never been convicted in connection to the 1993 heist. But Levi had once dated Aaron Bledsoe's sister, a detail buried in an old witness report. And in 2003, he'd served a short sentence for aggravated assault in upstate New York, the same time Mark had allegedly started receiving calls from an unknown number in that region. It was a thin thread, but Carla tugged at it. She tracked Levi to a small town in Pennsylvania, where he was working under a different name, Jacob Varlan, at an auto body shop. He'd kept his head down, stayed off the grid, but the past has a way of catching up. Under surveillance, Levi was observed purchasing a burner phone, using cash exclusively, and taking frequent drives, sometimes across state lines. Carla got a warrant.
When he was finally brought in for questioning, Levi sat quietly. He didn't ask for a lawyer, just stared at the photo of Mark Riley across the table. "I knew him," he said. "Once, a long time ago. Did you visit him in Belridge?" He hesitated. "No. We have phone records. And a witness who saw your car." Levi's jaw tensed. "He owed me," he said finally. "We made a deal before it all went sideways." "What kind of deal?" "That if it ever came down to it, he'd take the heat. He'd run, keep his mouth shut. And in return, I'd leave his family alone." "Did he have the money?" "No. I don't care about the money anymore. It wasn't about that." "Then what was it about?" Levi looked away. "He made a promise. And I made one too." Carla leaned forward. "Where is he, Levi?" "I don't know. I went to see him. Told him I hadn't forgotten. That I still knew where his sister lived. But he didn't flinch. Just looked at me like I didn't matter anymore." "What happened next?" "I left, got in my car, drove home." "But you didn't forget, did you?" Levi didn't respond. With no physical evidence linking him to a crime, and no body found, Carla had no grounds to hold him. He walked free. Later that night, Carla returned to Mark's home, retracing the space again, this time with an investigator's eye for memory. Something gnawed at her, a detail she hadn't yet understood. In the back of the house, tucked behind a false panel in the closet, she discovered a narrow box, locked with an old-fashioned clasp. Inside were a few items. A faded photograph of a teenage boy and girl standing by a lake, a letter, and a key. The letter was addressed to D.T. Diana Trask. It read, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out. Or I had to go again. Either way, I want you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. For leaving without answers. For never explaining why I couldn't stay. The truth is, I've lived more honestly as a lie than I ever did as myself. And maybe that's the punishment I deserve. Tell my sister I forgive her. She'll know why. And thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." Carla sat with the letter for a long time. The key, she would later discover, belonged to a post office box in Raleigh. Inside the box was a small collection of cash, around $4,000, and a second letter, unsigned, undated. It simply read, "He came for me. I walked into the woods. Maybe this time, I'll stay gone." The woods around Belridge are quiet in the late fall. The leaves, once vibrant with gold and crimson, have dulled into muted browns. The air carries the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something older, something that seems to remember. Carla Boone stood at the tree line, just beyond Mark Riley's home, staring into the vastness of nature that so many in Belridge had long taken for granted. She listened, and then she stepped in. The letter had changed everything. The final line, "He came for me. I walked into the woods. Maybe this time, I'll stay gone," had opened a new line of inquiry. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was a vanishing with intent, or perhaps surrender. The distinction mattered, but not as much as understanding whether the man once known as Aaron Bledsoe was alive somewhere, or whether this was the last place he'd stood. A search of the woods had already been conducted in the early days after his disappearance. It had been cursory, casual, the kind of search done when everyone still believed a missing person might have just taken a drive or gotten lost. But now, nearly 2 weeks later, Carla authorized a deeper search. The terrain was uneven, sloping in some areas, dense in others. Local volunteers joined in, the fire department, a few park rangers from a nearby county, and even teenagers from the high school who had admired Mark for helping out with the cross-country team. Some came for curiosity, others for closure. The search lasted 3 days. On the 4th they found a boot. It was weathered, partly buried beneath a layer of wet leaves, but unmistakably Mark's one he had worn often. The ground nearby had signs of disturbance, a slight depression, some torn fabric, and a rusted silver chain tangled in the underbrush. No body, no clear signs of a struggle, but enough to confirm that Mark had come into these woods. Whether he'd walked in willingly or was forced, that remained unclear. Carla took the evidence back to the station and stared at the chain. It wasn't jewelry. It looked more like a keychain or a pendant, something a man might carry for sentimental value. She remembered the hidden box in his closet, the letter to Diana, the photo of him and a young woman at the lake. The girl in the picture had never been identified. Carla had assumed it was Diana, but now she wasn't so sure. She sent the photo to facial recognition specialists in Phoenix. A day later, they responded. The girl was not Diana Trask. She was named Lillian Bledsoe, Aaron's sister, the same sister he had referenced in the letter with the line, "Tell my sister I forgive her. She'll know why." Carla dug into Lillian's history. After the robbery in 1993, she had disappeared from Phoenix as well. No charges had ever been filed against her. No arrest record, but her name appeared in the periphery of several old reports, witness statements, address confirmations, and finally a sealed juvenile court record. With a court order, Carla obtained access. Inside was a single document. Lillian had been removed from her home at age 14, following a confirmed case of domestic abuse. The perpetrator, her stepfather, the same man who had once kicked Aaron out of the house at 17. Carla sat with the file for hours. There were dots beginning to connect, but not in a straight line. Why had Aaron forgiven his sister? What role had she played? And most urgently, where was she now? A skip trace led Carla to a remote property in northern Arizona. The listed owner was a woman named Madeline Stone, but public records showed that name had only been in use since 2004. Prior to that, it had no history, no credit, no employment, nothing. Carla made the connection. Madeline Stone was Lillian Bledsoe. She called in a favor with the Phoenix PD, who sent 2 officers to make contact. They approached the property carefully. It was modest, a 1-story ranch house with faded siding and a wraparound porch. The woman who answered the door was in her late 40s, wearing flannel and worn jeans, her dark hair streaked with gray. When shown a picture of Aaron, Mark, her eyes welled up. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly. "Come in." Inside, the home was sparse but clean. A fire burned low in the fireplace, and the smell of sage lingered in the air. She led the officers to the living room, sat down and folded her hands. "I haven't seen my brother in more than 20 years," she began. "But I spoke to him once. About 5 years ago. He found me." "Did you talk about the robbery?" one of the officers asked. "No," she said. "We didn't have to." She paused, then looked toward a framed picture on the mantel. It was the same photo Carla had found in Mark's house. The lake, the 2 siblings. "That was the last day we were happy," she said. Madeline explained what she remembered of that time. Their mother had remarried a man named Victor Lang, a domineering presence, who turned cruel behind closed doors. Aaron had tried to protect her, tried to leave, then tried to come back. He'd gotten involved with Levi Calderon when he was desperate for money, for freedom. And when the robbery went wrong, he disappeared to protect her from the fallout. "I think he carried that guilt for the rest of his life," Lillian said. Even though none of it was his fault. She confirmed she had no contact with Levi, no knowledge of Aaron's whereabouts, and had not heard from Diana Trask in more than a decade. But she offered a final piece of information. "He used to write me," she said. "Letters. I never wrote back. I couldn't. But I kept them." She returned with a shoebox filled with aged envelopes, each dated, each bearing postmarks from cities all over the country. Carla would later read through them carefully, but one in particular stood out. Dated 6 months before Mark's disappearance, it read, "I think someone's watching me. I don't know who. I haven't told Diana. I don't want to worry her. But I see the same car outside sometimes. I hear clicks on the phone. I think it's Levi, or someone else from those days. If anything happens to me, it's not an accident, not a breakdown. I need you to know that." That letter changed the tone of the investigation. Carla returned to Belridge with renewed purpose. She pushed the state police to reclassify the case as a suspected homicide. She compiled the circumstantial evidence, the phone records showing contact with Levi, the witness testimony, the threats implied in Levi's own statements, the discovered boot, the note, but without a body, without direct physical evidence, there would be no charges. Still, the search expanded. Cadaver dogs were brought in. A small section of the woods was marked off after one dog indicated strongly near an area of disturbed ground, just a quarter-mile from where the boot had been found. The ground was soft, rich with decomposed leaves and clay. Forensic teams worked for days. Finally, they found human remains. It took a week to confirm, but dental records made it official. Mark Riley, Aaron Bledsoe, was dead. The remains showed signs of trauma. Blunt force injury to the skull, a cracked rib, defensive wounds. It was not suicide. It was not voluntary disappearance. It was a killing. But even now, with a body and a history of threats, the prosecution against Levi was complicated. He had an alibi for the night in question, cell phone tower pings, a hotel receipt in Pennsylvania. Unless someone could prove he'd hired someone, or that his alibi was falsified, he would remain free. Carla knew that time had a way of loosening tongues, so she waited, and then months later, a man came forward. A drifter, arrested in Tennessee on unrelated charges. His name was Benny Torrance. He was in his 40s, wiry, with a gaunt face and tremors in his hands. He had once served time in the same prison as Levi Calderon, and in exchange for a reduced sentence, he told the authorities that Levi had offered him money to put a man in the ground. The payment, $10,000 up front, another $10,000 after the job. He gave me a photo, Benny said. Told me where the guy lived. Told me he had to disappear. That it'd be doing everybody a favor. Benny claimed he refused the job, but he remembered the man in the photo. It was him, he said, pointing to a picture of Mark Riley. That's the guy. Carla submitted the statement. It was enough to reopen the case against Levi on new grounds, but Levi was already gone, disappeared from his home. No trace left, no credit card use, no cell signal, just a note, left on the counter of his apartment. I told you I kept my promises. Belridge didn't speak about Mark Riley for some time. After the discovery of his body in the forest, and the revelation of his former identity as Aaron Bledsoe, a quiet settled over the town, not one of scandal or outrage, but of a slow, respectful grief. A kind of bewildered mourning that lingered in the empty chairs of the diner, the quiet pew at the back of the church, the vacant space where he used to park his truck beside the library. No one had known him completely, and now, no one ever would. Carla Boone remained the only person in town who had seen the case from beginning to end, the only one who had read his letters, who had followed the trail of buried names and faded memories to the edge of something final, and even she wasn't sure what to make of it all. She returned often to that last note Levi Calderon left behind. I told you I kept my promises. It was smug, controlled. Not the scrawl of a desperate man, but a deliberate final word. Carla had known men like Levi before, men who saw themselves as sculptors of fate, as men who left messages behind like breadcrumbs only they could trace. But this wasn't a trail. It was an erasure. Levi was gone. She traced his movements back as far as she could. Security footage had last placed him at a gas station in Ohio, 5 days before the arrest warrant was issued. After that, nothing. No purchases. No sightings. His vehicle had been left abandoned at a rest stop along the I-90. The keys were inside. The tank was full. Carla considered that maybe he had taken his own life. Maybe, in the end, guilt or fear had overtaken him. But it didn't feel right. Not for a man like Levi. Not for someone who had waited nearly 3 decades to settle an old score. Someone who had orchestrated a vanishing like this. More likely, he had disappeared into the folds of the world, as Aaron had done before him, changed his name, altered his look, moved to another forgotten place. The predator once again became a shadow. And Aaron, Mark, was left behind, this time not just in memory, but in a shallow grave marked only by pine needles and time. The town held a memorial. It was small, quiet, no headstone, no burial. His remains were cremated and sent to a sister who would not speak to the press. Carla spoke briefly, standing beside a photo of Mark smiling at a town barbecue, holding a paper plate full of cornbread and ribs. "We didn't know everything about him," she said, "but we knew enough to love him." Afterward, a few townspeople stood to share their memories. The librarian spoke about the time he helped reshelve every single book after a storm had caused a leak in the ceiling. A young woman from the high school said he was the only adult who had ever asked if she was okay during a hard year. One elderly man said simply, "He was my friend." And then they went home. Carla stayed behind to gather the programs left on the chairs. The church emptied around her, soft music playing from the old organ in the back. She stood in the quiet, looking again at the picture. Smiling, ordinary, gone. Later that week she returned to his house. It had been officially released to the county, as there were no next of kin willing to claim it. Lillian had signed the paperwork to forfeit the estate. The house stood as he'd left it, clean, minimal, full of a life paused. Carla walked through each room. The living room, where the television sat silent, a stack of old westerns neatly lined up on the shelf. The kitchen, where a shopping list still hung on the fridge. Milk, apples, ground beef, coffee. The bedroom, where the letter had been found tucked into the bottom drawer of a dresser no one had thought to search. There was something else Carla wanted to find. She returned to the garage. It was tidy, just as it had been before, but she examined it with a different eye. This time, she noticed the thin crack along the back wall. A hairline split in the drywall. Behind it she found a hidden panel. Inside, a metal box. She brought it into the light. Inside were more letters. Letters that had never been sent. They were addressed to names Carla didn't recognize. But each one began the same way. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer Mark Riley." Some of them were confessions, accounts of the robbery, the betrayal, the years in hiding. Others were stories, fragments of life he'd lived under various names. A summer spent in Oregon working on a fishing boat. A year in Nevada repairing slot machines. A woman named Elise, who he'd loved but left after she grew too curious. But the last letter was different. It was dated 2 days before his disappearance. "I keep thinking about the night it happened, when I opened the door and saw Levi standing there. He didn't look angry. He looked amused, like the world had circled back just to give him the punchline. I invited him in. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired of running. Maybe I thought if we talked, if I could just explain, it would end differently. But I was wrong. He wanted something from me. Not money, not an apology, just fear. He wanted to see it in my eyes. I gave it to him. I won't pretend otherwise. I think he's going to kill me. And if he doesn't, I may do it myself. I'm tired, Liv. I'm tired of being half a man in someone else's life. I'm tired of locking doors that won't stay shut. I don't know how much more of this I can carry." Carla sat with the letter for a long time. She'd always wondered why Mark hadn't told anyone about Levi's reappearance, why he hadn't called the police, or warned Diana, or asked for help.
But this letter held the answer. He was already done running. His death had not come out of nowhere. It had been a culmination of pain, of guilt, of history revisited. Levi may have delivered the final blow, but the weight of the past had long since settled into Aaron's bones. And still, he had tried. He had built a life, however small. He had planted flowers. He had helped children cross the street. He had learned to smile again. In the end, maybe that was all any of them could do. The investigation into Levi Calderon remained open, but dormant. No further sightings emerged. No leads. Carla suspected that if Levi was still alive, he was far away, somewhere the law wouldn't follow, or perhaps somewhere the law never mattered. Belridge moved on. Slowly. A new family bought the house, painted the porch, replaced the mailbox, planted hydrangeas in the garden. The neighbors waved politely, brought casseroles. The name Mark Riley faded from conversation, but not from memory. Carla kept one letter, the one Mark had written to Lillian, the one that ended with "Tell her I forgive her. She'll know why." One day, she would deliver it. Not yet, but someday. Until then, she kept it in her desk drawer, beside her badge and a small faded photograph of the lake, where a brother and sister had once stood, smiling into the sun, unaware of the years ahead. And in the quiet spaces of Belridge, where the woods grow thick and the wind hums through the pines, there remained the faintest echo of footsteps once walked by a man who'd hoped, for a little while, to become someone else. He didn't disappear. He simply became part of the silence. Thank you for listening, and make sure to check out our other videos if you enjoyed this one. Good night.